It all began with the sky itself becoming angry at people and turning scarlet, clouds covering the horizon, and an eclipse splitting the sun into pieces. The hot sand melted under the flames of the heavens. The suffering faces of nature on the mountain peaks begged for mercy. The silence and howling wind were cut by the vile squeal of a hideous monster. Streams of mucus flowing from its toothy mouth. A man running towards him with a heavy backpack on his back shouted back, waving a small but sharp dagger in his hands. The monster that attacked the man was an alien worm with a huge mouth and many legs. Its red pairs of eyes merged with the redness of the sky. The man, breathing heavily, leaned on both hands, tormenting the soft throat of the monster from the inside. After some time, the monster fell to the ground. The worm's mistake was that, obeying its instincts and desire to kill, it recklessly relied only on its own strength. The man, stained with someone else's mucus and blood, wiped it from his face with his sleeve, exhaling heavily. Having barely recovered from the shock and the realization that he had been able to kill the monster with his own hands, his thoughts were interrupted by a scream. The man was called Unawakened. There was a worm lying at his feet, but when he raised his head, the stranger was stunned, because behind the team that had summoned him, monsters of unimaginably huge and furious size had gathered. A blond man in a red windbreaker shouted that the porter should work properly and collect the drops. A guy in a mask standing nearby shook his head. The man hadn't seen any corpses at all. He nervously grabbed the straps of his backpack with both hands and awkwardly shifted his weight on the spot, showering himself with apologies. The team cursed and moved on, commenting as a parting shot that the porters had become completely useless. The man froze, thoughts flowing through his head in a painful and hot molten stream. The world changed after the discovery of the Abyss, another dimension where monsters that existed only in fantasy actually lived. Moreover, after the discovery of the Abyss, extraordinary powers awakened in people, and with them, humanity began to destroy monsters and conquer the Abyss. Now, because of all this, people have come to be judged not by their personality or efforts, but by their rank of awakening. If you have a high rank, a good life is guaranteed. The man tore open the defeated monster's guts, pulling out a pink crystal from its body. He clutched it in his hand, never ceasing to think that he was only a porter, carrying the things of the awakened, since he himself had not managed to awaken at the age of 35. And until he awakens, he will not be able to live their life. Now all he could do was notify when the prey was collected. The porter turned around and his mouth dropped open in shock. The entire team of brilliant awakened ones had been killed. The boys were killed with obvious brutality, and a trickle of sweat ran down the man's face from the realization that he could be next. And so it happened. A thunderous, divine voice behind him announced that there was only one survivor left. The SSS rank monster, Asmodeus, whose horns seemed to support the very remains of the sun, looked at the insect man beneath his feet with narrowed red eyes. Frightened to the point of madness, the man, through a veil of horror and rage, performed the same maneuver as before with the worm. It was obvious that for the demon, the small human dagger was nothing more than a toy. So with a light movement of one of his hands, he cut off half of the guy's arm. The monster released the limb, its body made of human skulls, not even flinching. The porter fell to the ground screaming, clutching his elbow from which blood was oozing. The man struggled to his feet, swallowing angry tears. And at that moment, Asmodeus raised his hand again. From his long finger, a stream of either lightning or some otherworldly substance shot down, straight into the man's head. Blood began to flow from the point on the skin where the demonic weapon had pierced, and it ran down the porter's clothes. But he couldn't even move. Blood mixed with tears, his gaze stopped on the demon, and moments from the life of a real loser flashed through his head. His parents died in a car accident, he was bullied at school, and here he was ignored for the rest of his life because he was unawakened. In my fading consciousness, the thought still darted around like a bird in a cage, that I really didn't want to die as an ordinary porter, a loser, damn life. The man clenched his teeth with all his might. Blood continued to flow down his face, and the word awakening rang in his ears. In the darkness of space, the last drop of blood lit up with a bright light, sparkling like a precious stone. The space was illuminated by the brightness of multicolored flashes flickering in oblivion. All the conditions for awakening were satisfied. The landscape around the porter changed right before his eyes. Instead of a scorching desert, there was a planet. Instead of mountain peaks, there was a golden staircase and an unearthly deity hovering above it. The blood from his face disappeared, washed away. The man opened his mouth, looking at the majestic figure. Long white hair almost covered the face of the deity. The naked figure without signs of gender was as if carved from stone. The porter, in a momentary fit of confusion, eclipsed by horror, began to turn around. Has Asmodeus, this cruel demon who spits on human pain, really stopped? After all, a second ago the man was definitely not here. And now, like an observer, he looked at his own weakened body. The deity was already at the bottom of the stairs and was now softly laughing at the surprised man. The man fell to his knees, staring in amazement at the stately figure, asking who was in front of him. The gracefully sculpted lips stretched into a smile. The man did not need to worry about this because the deity who was called the king was supposed to grant the porter power. The poor man didn't understand anything. The words he was saying were all mixed up in his head. And most importantly, could this creature really have stopped Asmodeus? And although the porter did not utter a word, he realized with horror that he had heard an answer to his thoughts. The deity was asking him to trust him more. This someone sat on a throne that appeared out of nowhere, saying that he simply recognized the will of the man and his perseverance, and therefore chose him. But it would be better if the man thought about the impossibility of such a miracle. The porter saw a strange, huge palm reaching out to him, and in fear he asked again what the creature meant. The deity laughed again and asked to wait patiently for the moment when the chosen one would understand everything. The creature called upon a certain key, and suddenly, right above the two figures, a huge monster opened its mouth full of sharp teeth. The porter passed out, his mind drifting off somewhere far away, but not even a few seconds had passed before a bright light hid his closed eyes and strange childish voices began to sound in his head. The awakening was anything but gentle. The man was completely awake and confused at the same time when he was punched in the face. He opened his eyes sharply, and as soon as his head jerked from another blow, the offender asked if the victim had finally woken up. Almost falling, the stunned man saw Bae Hexa in front of him, who was laughing, saying that the opponent needed to be hit so that he would at least hear something. The porter named Taehyung, whose name was spat out contemptuously, didn't expect to see the bully from high school in front of him. Another blow sobered the man a little, who remembered himself while in the abyss. After all, he had been given power. Turning his head, Taehyung saw the system's inscriptions on the bloody canvas, his name, age, and rank. He had returned 16 years ago. A crazy thought flashed through my head, giving me strength and bringing a smile to my face. Unable to contain himself, Taehyung threw his head back and burst into laughter like a madman. Heksu abruptly let go of his classmate and took a few steps back along with his friends. They did not understand the reason for the guy's sudden madness. The red-haired bully got angry and was about to attack Taehyung, shouting insults in his face. But he was unable to achieve what he wanted, as someone else's fist landed in the hooligan's face. The blow was so strong that blood spurted from his broken lip. Heksu fell on his back, as if he had been thrown far back. His friends turned around in fear, not knowing whether to help the leader or deal with the offender. Beaten, but so happy, even though he looked crazy, Taehyung continued to smile. He was breathing heavily and didn't even notice how hot tears were running down his cheeks. Now the guy was also awakened. The sun illuminated several figures on the school roof. Heksu still hadn't risen since the attack. Taehyung silently watched the offenders. He sniffled and wiped away his tears with the back of his hand. Heksu's friends decided to use their abilities and summoned flames and thorny ice. They rushed at Taehyung, covering him with curses. The guy with the fire ability extended his hand, directing a fire blast at the offender of his leader, but it missed the target. But Taehyung took advantage of his classmate's hesitation and hit him with all his might from below on the chin. The second opponent didn't even have time to touch his victim before he flew back with a groan, having received a kick to the stomach. Throughout his unawakened life, Taehyung did everything he could. He trained without sparing any effort. I also studied all the available information about the abyss and its monsters, no matter how frightening it was. The man even collected all kinds of data on various skills including wrestling. And now, having received a second chance, he will never lose to some uneducated bullies. It was obvious that they didn't know the very basics. Their technique was so terrible, and Taehyung dealt with them just as skillfully. When the offenders were spread out on the ground, Taehyung flexed his fists, smiling and concluding that he would need to train again. Suddenly, he heard someone groaning behind him and slowly turned towards the familiar voice. Heksu woke up only now. He was rubbing his bruised face, cursing dirty at the awakened Taehyung. He instantly flared up with rage, promising to kill his opponent, and stone blocks began to grow right out of the guy's body. This was the stone skin ability, which strengthened the body with stone growths. Heksu swung to hit his opponent, but he managed to get into a lower position and successfully dodged it. Taehyung gritted his teeth and straightened up, but the other person's movements left pieces of stone in the air, painfully scratching his skin. He quickly got his bearings and raised his head in time, as the awakened one was already attacking from above. Hexu landed on the ground with incredible force, the floor beneath his feet crumbling, sending heavy piles of dust and rock into the air. The boy remained sitting, listening to the sounds, waiting for the dust to settle. In this dense funnel behind the awakened one, Taehyung appeared invisibly. He deceived the enemy, making him think that he was under attack. The newborn awakened bared his teeth and attacked Hexa, but he turned sharply, as if he already knew what would happen next. Taehyung let out a strangled cry as his fist suddenly began to bleed. As it turned out, Hex didn't let the skin get touched, but turned to the enemy with the part of his face where the sharpest edges were. And now he was grinning mockingly. Taehyung hissed, realizing that he had only hurt himself, and only managed to put his fists in front of himself before the next blow. The strong awakened one swung and threw the still weak Taehyung away from himself. He was thrown far back, landing on a hard wall, almost knocking him unconscious. Blood from his broken forehead was pouring into his eyes. Taehyung was lying in piles of rubble, all wounded and coughing violently. Hexu slowly approached him, laughing. He called the guy a bad actor, asking if he had finally come to his senses. A look of disgust appeared on the big guy's face. He called Taehyung a worthless, unawakened bastard. He grinned again, asking what he would do. Would he really try to run away again? Or maybe he will continue to try to gain powers, blindly relying on what he calls the skills of an awakened one. Taehyung remained silent. He knew that all awakened ones receive a skill and rank, starting from F rank, when the chosen one is not distinguished from an ordinary person. Ending at S rank, when one is worthy of being called a monster, the physical abilities and skills of awakened ones grow exponentially. Taehyung was unlucky. He received an F rank, the worst of all, and the skill Predator, which had not even been thoroughly studied until now. Just when Taehyung decided that he would never be able to handle Hexu, who had a C rank, something changed, and even the enemy's gaze became uncomprehending. The boy, who seemed already broken and defeated, suddenly came to life, blood-red energy flowing through his body, merging with the streams of blood. It was as if someone possessing incredible power had entered Taehyung and was now controlling this still weak body. The primordial voice reported that it did not feel like it had lost. The guy slowly rose to his feet, and around him a bloody flame literally blazed and danced in circles like a tornado. Hexu felt himself being blown off his feet by the emerging wind. He couldn't believe that the worthless Kim Taehyung had actually woken up. The former ordinary schoolboy tried to move his palm, fixing his gaze on it. He really felt how magic obediently flowed through his body. He didn't know what was happening, but it would all end if he killed the caster. At that moment, the enraged Hexu ran at the enemy with a roar, almost completely covered in stone from anger. Taehyung waited until the enemy ran up very close and put his hand in front of him. The awakened energy obeyed him with lightning speed and attacked. When Hexu, having brought almost all his strength into the blow, saw that the boy was controlling the flames with a wave of one hand, he froze. Taehyung himself seemed to be in a daze and acted on intuition. Biting his lower lip, he simply did what his newfound strength told him to do, relying completely on it. The funnel shifted to the middle, and then Hexu screamed in pain. All the stones gradually flew off him. At the same time, he lost his strength. Only small flashes could be seen in the air from afar if the students looked out the windows. But the next moment, the sky behind them turned red. Taehyung focused on his power, stretching out his hand. Explosions sounded around him and thick smoke was visible. Hex's face froze, his mouth dropped open as if in surprise and his eyes rolled back. Taehyung slowly lowered his hand, then looked down at his classmate's feet. The guy who just a minute ago was the strongest of the awakened now fell face down on the ground, raising heaps of dust. Taehyung screamed and came to his senses. His face was covered in sweat, and someone's voice in his head announced that the devouring was complete. Small stones began to appear on his hand, and as a result of absorbing the target, his rank changed to F. Moreover, the guy now had a new skill registered, Stone Skin. The pretty nurse in the school medical office turned in her chair toward the door and gasped. One shabby-looking boy was dragging along several classmates who looked no better. He greeted me hoarsely with a slightly trembling voice, and when he raised his head, blood was visible streaming from his broken forehead. After a second of silence, the nurse, having recovered from the shock, squealed questioningly. Taehyung immediately carried the children, including Bae Hexa, to the medical center after the fight. There, the nurse cured him with her healing skills using magical powers. I had to lie to her clumsily, telling her about the cause of the injury, a fall down the stairs, and thus managed to persuade the woman to continue without unnecessary questions. A little later, Taehyung left the school gates. He was completely healthy. He woke up and even got even with Heksu. But there remained a problem with the Predator, a new entity that appeared in the hero. Now his rank could change after the very first battle. It may be an F rank skill, but it has the power of a C rank. Now Taehyung can even absorb other people's skills. The student walked thoughtfully up the stairs, not understanding why this mysterious king had given him such power and regressed him from an ordinary loser. Taehyung realized that he had only one thing left to do in this situation: find out more about the Predator. The guy approached a 2-story house with green gates and stopped, looking at the windows. He smiled dreamily and a little sadly, muttering out loud that he hadn't been home for a long time. After the death of his beloved parents, the boy remained to live with his uncle. Taehyung literally climbed into the apartment without asking. Knowing that his uncle would be late, he planned to look for information about such skills on his own. Strange sounds were heard behind one of the doors. The guy tiptoed over and carefully opened the door. A strange picture appeared before him. 3 strangers, 2 of whom were wearing masks, and a teenager on the floor collecting money. The boy suddenly raised his head and screamed. His freckled face turned red. He shouted the guest's name. He recognized Hwang Jae-yong, his younger relative, and asked in surprise why he wasn't at school. The boy's gaze fell on the box, under which were scattered bills and coins. He remembered that even before his own regression, this boy wanted to make friends with other bandits and took all the money from the house, getting into trouble. The strangers began to aggressively ask their victim who the stranger was that had come during the day. Taehyung realized that today was exactly what had happened. The bandit raised an eyebrow and shook his head mockingly, saying that now his interest was satisfied. He learned about Jaehyun's cousin. Taehyung watched everyone in the room carefully, trying to understand what was going on here. The gang leader, a tall, thin, blonde man, approached the guy, threatening to kill him, saying that they would just take what they needed and leave. He stood a head taller than Taehyung and casually patted him on the head, calling him an awakened elder. But instead of being scared, the bandit saw a grin on someone else's face and was stunned, his mouth slightly open in question when they told him they wanted to test something. While the stranger was thinking, Taehyung rose up on his toes and pushed him to the ground, pressing his hand to his left shoulder. He started coughing, fluttering around like a fish in water. He had not expected such an outburst from the boy at all. Jane was also stunned. Frozen in place, the other 2 masked bandits perked up, ready to defend their leader. Taehyung, taking advantage of his opponent's hesitation, sat on top of him and reached for his head. He screamed in fear, trying to dodge, because he understood what would follow this movement. The hoarse screams gradually died down, and the bandit, not without reason, called the guy who attacked him a predator. A slightly crazy smile appeared on Taehyung's face, and a victorious sparkle played in his eyes. But suddenly the joy gave way to bewilderment. A voice in my head whispered that the predator function was unavailable. The heavily breathing opponent slowly opened his eyes and stared at Taehyung with his mouth slightly open. The same one was still hanging over him, with an open palm, and large drops of sweat were running down the schoolboy's face. Taehyung was so stunned by what was happening and the betrayal of the system that he didn't immediately notice the movement towards his head. The blonde felt completely in control of the situation, and with a lunge of his right hand, he hit Taehyung painfully on the head. He coughed hoarsely, finding himself lying on the hard floor a few seconds later. The blonde was already standing on his feet and felt much more confident, shouting curses at the schoolboy. One of his masked henchmen was awakened and directed the power of his chain abilities at the boy. The second one put his hand to his mouth and exhaled poisonous purple air. The leader, adjusting the bandage on his nose, grinned and sent poisonous vines of bleeding to his enemy. 3 awakened abilities attacked Taehyung at the same time. At first he cowered, but after a few seconds he no longer pretended to be weak, and the whole house shook. A thick column of purple smoke appeared in front of the dangerous trio and did not disperse. The blonde chuckled dismissively, muttering that the unawakened dared to pretend to be awakened and did not know his place at all. Suddenly, the system's voice was heard announcing that skill usage had been detected, and a silhouette appeared through the veil of smoke. The system confirmed the skills of chains, poison, and bleeding. Parts of the beast appeared before those present. Taehyung stood right in front of him and his defense. The resistance was obtained through mystical power. The guy grinned triumphantly, and stone armor suddenly grew on his arm. Suddenly, the power didn't work, and then neutralized the skills. The blonde froze in shock, feeling the air around him heat up. And the next moment something happened that he completely didn't expect. The weak and feeble Taehyung gained incredible strength and brought down an incredible blow on him, slamming him into the wall. The bandit, whose teeth had disappeared from his mouth as a result of the attack and whose face had turned into a bloody mess, looked at the enemy's glowing white eyes. The blonde was amazed at his strength because just a few minutes ago it had not been there at all. Taehyung stood by the window, the sunlight shining through the curtains and softly falling on his shoulders. He put his hands in his pockets, looking with a smile at the bandits sprawled on the floor. Now Taehyung learned two things. The status window is only visible to the awakened. It displays some information about the awakened. There was no shortage of mana, but the predator did not activate. Also, the passive effect of the predator is not indicated in the description. It neutralizes all negative effects. The guy thought gradually he would be able to confirm his assumptions. His thoughts were racing into the distance, but suddenly, Taehyung noticed how Jaeyoung threw himself at his feet, bowing to the very ground. The boy raised his head sharply and shouted in a respectful tone that, having just seen the incredible side of his elder, he, his cousin, repented of what he had done and asked for forgiveness. Taehyung raised an eyebrow as he listened to the boy profess his loyalty to him, swearing eternal allegiance. His relative had never shown such compliance before. But the problem wasn't even Jin. But what was about to happen? Clouds were gathering in the sky above the people and they didn't even notice it. The boy had even started barking like a dog, but suddenly he fell silent because Taehyung promised to forgive him. He folded his arms across his chest and lifted his chin, declaring that Jaeyeon would now come with him. Sometime later, several people appeared in front of a building, probably a factory. A sign stated that only authorized persons could enter the area. The trio were dressed in formal suits. The man in glasses looked up seriously, and the two girls behind him did not hide their astonished looks. And there was nothing to be surprised about. It seemed that things were going very badly because the gates had been breached. Unimaginably vile monsters were bursting out into the world from the burst sphere. The man noticed that 10 years had passed since the last disaster, when a gate suddenly appeared and the monsters began to crawl away. The long-haired girl quietly said that given the monsters and the inaction, there were only moments left before the disaster. Her colleagues shouted that the surrounding areas needed to be evacuated. The man sharply replied that there was no need because he had his barrier skill. The sphere's shell stretched like a ball. The man knew that the enemy's rank was only C. This means that the strongest monster that can come out from there is also a C rank. The sphere burst behind the man, but he told his stunned colleagues that even if an unexpected crisis occurred, everything would be fine. An incredibly vile monster, a head without a body with a protruding tongue, was knocked aside by a well-aimed kick from a man. He wasn't lying. He really could provide protection to the population with his power. The glasses flashed dangerously in the evening light, and in the madness that was unfolding, the fire bursting out of the sphere, as B ranked, they would be able to hold back the breakthrough. Jane ran somewhere in the silence of the night. If there was someone to protect the city, everything should be fine. The boy shouted to Taehyung that he himself had told about the presence of management personnel at the site of the supposed disaster. He didn't deny his words because the original mana of these enemies was at the C rank level, and the personnel who arrived there were B rank, so C rank monsters were no obstacle to them. Jaeyoung was even a little offended by his relative, since he had spoken about it himself earlier, but only if he was actually a C rank enemy. Meanwhile, near the broken shell, the bodies of monsters lay piled up in a heap. The man in the suit had just finished dealing with another one. He was breathing heavily, coughing into his fist. It was strange that these low-ranking monsters were able to break through his B-rank barrier. The warrior turned around abruptly. He felt uneasy because the mana emanating from the sphere was of a rank higher than his. The girls stood closer to the gate. They called the leader because they noticed something. And indeed, something they had not seen before was clicking its huge teeth. A huge mouth soon burst open, and the roaring sound almost deafened the people present. No one expected to see such a huge troll with several pairs of glowing eyes and a muscular body. It was an A-rank ogre giant. He arrived with his minions, but even so, he surpassed all humans in strength. Large beads of sweat were running down the man's face as he looked in shock at the monster, whose rank was far from C. The fire that was slowly erupting from the gate turned into a massive explosion in a second, engulfing the entire area. Jaeyoung continued to run after Taehyung, admitting that he was right. But how could his relative know about the trouble since even the area hadn't been evacuated yet? Taehyung, in turn, knew that he had already been through this, but he spoke out loud about his intuition. He rolled his eyes and this angered the boy. Of course he didn't believe someone else's words. The relative continued to express his disbelief when suddenly, around the corner, both saw a terrifying picture. All sorts of monsters led by an ogre were running behind the crowd of people with a deafening roar. The fleeing human crowd literally drowned under the monster's feet, continuing to warn those who did not yet know what was happening. Pleas and cries for help were heard everywhere. Jane stopped abruptly and squealed like a girl, but the elder calmly reminded him what needed to be done. The boy, trembling with fear, turned to Taehyung, hysterically asking what he would do. Stone armor appeared on the boy's body under the dumbfounded gaze of the younger one. He was going to deal with this abomination and be there. A dark-haired man was looking out of the window at the city, talking to someone. Seeing that the situation was getting worse because the C-rank gate had been broken through by an A-rank force and it was impossible to send reinforcements, he turned around abruptly, his voice filled with despair, as he said that the only solution to the crisis now was an awakened A-rank. The man began shouting to his interlocutor that he was their only hope. The young man bit his lip, swallowing back tears. It was the awakened A-rank Blade of Madness and Hyunsu. He was both scared and sorry for the dead people, so he gathered all his will into a fist and swore that he would come to the rescue. The guy's peculiarity is the 8th grader syndrome. The small head, resembling a frog's on a tiny body, almost broke off from the impact. The tall green ogre threw back his head, spitting blood. Taehyung had accurately hit him in the chest. Another body flew into a pile of similarly slain A-rank monsters. The guy's hands were ablaze with the righteous fire of ability. Black threads were crawling like snakes across the space. Sometimes he didn't even have to do anything, just one movement of his hand, and the monster's limbs would fly off. A grin crossed his face. Could it be that the predator didn't work because he was 50% tired? Most skills use mana, but that doesn't mean you only need to worry about it. Because there is fatigue, it increases if you use skills or move. And the higher the fatigue, the more the power of skills decreases and the heavier the body becomes. Taehyung, fortunately, realized that he could absorb the bodies of monsters, thereby restoring mana without spending it. The system declared the target's life activity to be stopped, and the user restored his mana. But what was much better than this news was that the guy's rank had increased to D, and besides that, his skills had also improved. The more he uses Predator, the stronger he becomes. At this rate, he can become an S or even SS rank, or even the first SSS rank. When the monsters were dealt with, Taehyung shook himself off and decided to return to Jaehyung. But the hero couldn't leave so easily. As soon as he turned around, someone's huge body smashed through the wall of the building. A frail-looking guy, unfamiliar to him, swung his bright, glowing gold weapon at the dirty monster, threatening to avenge the souls of those killed. Kensu, shedding tears, shouted that, being a warrior of justice, he would bring the monster to justice. Taehyung, listening to this, only raised an eyebrow ironically. After all, other people's words sounded a little absurd. The monster, however, was not thrilled with the planned revenge, and roared with all his might, swinging at the little man. Hensu's eyes lit up with a bright light. He dodged and gripped the dagger tighter in his hands. Then everything that happened took a split second. The guy began to chop with his weapon everywhere he could reach. In the distance, a column of judgmental flame rose above the buildings. So hard did the awakened one try. Taehyung still stood motionless, watching the battle. He didn't know what to do. The guy admired the victory of the awakened one. It was probably he who possessed the A rank, the one who allowed the gate to be broken through in Taehyung's past life. Hyunsu's Blade of Madness. The rumors about it weren't lying. It really is incredibly powerful. The boy shook his finger and winked, rejoicing in his own victory because the stupid monster died from his sword of justice. Taehyung sighed because he remembered not only Hyunsu's desperate strength, but also his stupid nature, and yet it was strange why he was here. Before the protagonist's regression, Hensu was fighting an ogre in another part of the city, but now he stood and prayed for the well-being of the residents. Taehyung opened his mouth slightly, looking at the awakened man in the silence of the night. Somewhere in the back of his mind, he felt something was wrong with what was happening. The system announced the sensation of skill use, and a figure that had quietly appeared behind Hensu pierced his body with a dagger. He coughed up blood. His thin eyebrows drew together, and there was genuine resentment in his voice. A skinny, tall man with deathly pale skin and a bony face grinned, hissing that Hensu was caught. The city gradually lost its familiar outlines, but a false calm still reigned in people's homes. Jaeyeon leaned over the woman lying on the sofa, covered with a blanket. She seemed to be fast asleep. The guy frowned and wondered if everything was okay, then shuddered, because he had been predicted the death of many people. Taehyung looked seriously at his relative, and for some reason focused on the imminent death of the school nurse, Choi Nayeon. And the woman will die because she will help others instead of evacuating from the destroyed streets of the city. Since Jae can put people to sleep with his sleep skill, Taehyung ordered the stunned boy to do just that. The elder turned to leave and promised over his shoulder to deal with the rest. Now, Jae stood in their school nurse's apartment and wondered how Taehyung had found out about everything. Suddenly, an incredible guess struck his head, and the boy's gaze tensely stared at the wall. What he thought made sense, there was no other way to explain it. At that moment, the sleeping Nayeon frowned in her sleep. Jae vividly imagined the image in his mind, his elder, awakened with the skill of foresight. And although Taehyung would probably roll his eyes at this, the boy did not stop imagining him as a great magician. And now, the guy, with a slightly hysterical grin, understood that something was going wrong, looking at the wounded awakened one. On the huge corpse of the monster, the pierced blade of madness retreated from the strange man. He held his bloody chest and shouted to the stranger, asking who he was. The bald man laughed madly, muttering under his breath that the guy was alive even with his vital organs punctured, which was surprising. Ranks are completely different. Suddenly, his gaze glazed over and his eyes, like a lizard's, began to look in different directions. He howled that it would only be more fun. It was the B-rank villain Han Sandro with the stealth skill. Awakened people who commit crimes are called villains. Sandro is one of them, a murderous maniac who killed people for his own pleasure during the gate breakthrough. But here's the catch. Taehyung was sure that in his past life the villain and the awakened one had never met. He thought dejectedly that the future might have changed precisely because of his appearance. Hensu was mad with rage. Despite his wound, he continued to stand on his feet, cursing. The fiery blade appeared in his hands again, and the boy rushed at Sandro, threatening to punish him with his own hands. But suddenly, the warrior's hand stopped obeying him. He began to cough hoarsely, his eyes wide. The huge blade was pulled to the side, and even the villain froze in place, peering somewhere. Inexplicably, the giant's corpse beneath their feet came to life, the huge iron pendant on his neck stretching upward. The monster opened its eyes and growled, revealing rows of dagger-like teeth. The two opponents fell to the ground. While Hensu was beside himself with shock, Sandro was only pleased. He laughed and rejoiced at the incredible regeneration of the A-rank monster. Without letting go of the sword, the awakened one tried to take the right position for the attack. The villain landed on his feet, rising with difficulty. He decided to leave Hensu to the freak, the ogre. The man turned around to run away and gave a mad look with his red glowing eyes. He looked straight at Taehyung, the observer who found himself in the thick of things. Sandro stuck out his tongue and jumped up laughing and rushed towards the guy, intending to plunge a dagger into him because the more victims, the better. Taehyung didn't expect such an attack at all and froze in place, feverishly thinking about what to do. The villain looked terrifying, with a thin face covered in taut skin and glowing eyes, his weapon moving ever faster towards the awakened one's neck. But another second, and the steel hit the stone surface, which instantly appeared on Taehyung's neck. He chuckled, calling the villain an idiot. Straightening up and putting his hands in his pockets, the guy knocked the villain down with one movement of his leg, wounding him. He still managed to get his bearings, maintaining his balance. Laughing again, the man realized that in front of him was an awakened person. As he was about to attack, he froze because the stranger called out his name and rank. Taehyung walked towards the villain with long strides, asking if he was the psycho in front of him who loved to kill using his stealth skill. His palm was covered with stone armor, and a smile played on his lips. Taehyung was glad of such a meeting. Sandro was not going to give up and still struck the other man's hand with a knife. Of course, the stones reflected the blow. Cursing loudly, the villain advanced with enviable persistence, trying to find a vulnerable spot in the awakened one. Taehyung remained vigilant, covering himself with both hands that were covering the stones. Now the guy had only one weapon against the sharp blade, his own hands, endowed with power. A war dance began, where the partners desired only one thing, the death of their opponent. Finding time to rest, the fighters found themselves a few meters away from each other. Sandro admitted that the boy was quite skilled and confident. As it turned out, even the blades did not cause harm to the awakened one, despite the fact that the stone fragments flew in all directions. And while the huge revived ogre tried to defeat the Blade of Madness, the villain did not know how the awakened one understood who he was, but he thinks that he has a chance to survive. Taehyung didn't pay any attention to the fight nearby, as he was extremely focused on his own battle. The bald man's mouth stretched into a smile, and even the skin on his skull stretched, clearly showing the cross-shaped scar. Taehyung should have understood that the world doesn't follow plans. At that moment, the scoundrel simply disappeared. The guy realized that he had used the ability of stealth. Now it was worth being on guard, because now the enemy could appear out of nowhere. But this was also strange, because the villain knew that in any case, he would not be able to cause harm. Having said this out loud, Taehyung heard the insinuating whisper of his opponent behind him. He only laughed at such an assumption. The guy, confident in his untouchability, did not expect at all that the villain who appeared before him would be able to inflict a serious wound on his hand with the tip of a dagger. Taehyung looked in amazement at his stone hand, cut in half, so deep that the bleeding didn't even stop. The villain laughed as usual, asking the guy if he knew how many like him had already been killed. These fools who believed that their skills were invincible, Sandro circled around the enemy like the wind, inflicting more and more blows on him. As it turns out, once they realize their weakness, they immediately become lost and die from the desire to escape. So Taehyung also needs to understand something before he dies. Before pushing the guy with all his might with his body, the villain shouted that all skills have weaknesses. Taehyung was breathing heavily and hoarsely. Trying to get to his feet, blood was flowing from his mouth. To his regret, the guy was completely unaware of this disadvantage of stone skin. It does not block the blow completely. The unbearable shock breaks the stone, and the destroyed part is replaced by a stone with significantly reduced strength. Sandro knew about this from somewhere and was trying to achieve this effect from the very beginning. Taehyung smirked, but now he was absolutely sure that he could withstand a one-on-one fight against a B rank, because his physical abilities were much higher than the average D rank. The guy straightened up, and this confused his opponent, who began to examine his prey. He looked much more confident, and Sandro decided that the cornered boy had simply gone crazy. Taehyung asked with a smirk if the B-rank villain knew why the awakened one wanted to meet him so much. He only mocked his opponent, but he was no longer laughing when the beast appeared next to Taehyung. A huge shadow of someone else's hand covered the man, and he immediately noticed the ominous mana that he had been hiding for a long time. But the villain wasn't going to give up so easily. He laughed and called the guy an idiot. He immediately turned on invisibility and began circling around his enemy, believing that he would not be able to catch him. Taehyung's outstretched hand, which controlled the long, stretching lines, clenched. The villain himself said that all skills have weaknesses. This became clear to the guy when he absorbed ugly and strong monsters. Some of them kept escaping his sight, but eventually the predator caught up with them all. To put it simply, Sandro cannot be defeated. Even now, the man did not understand that his minutes were numbered and did not immediately notice the long tentacles around him. The moment Taehyung's eye lit up red, he said that the predator would catch its target no matter what. The blade fell from the enemy's weakened hands as he finally realized everything. The boy smiled as his palm closed, accompanied by a heart-rending cry of horror and pain. The city survived despite the fears of its inhabitants, and now a bright sun rose over the tall buildings. In the place where the battle took place at night, the unfortunate Hensu lay on the destroyed land. The guy wasn't sleeping or unconscious. He was muttering something under his breath, scratching the ground. He raised his bloody head with some difficulty, lamenting the villain who had ruined the entire plan, because even he, Hensu, could not defeat death. At this time, a huge shadow, still unnoticed by the hero, appeared in front of him. He hadn't felt so exhausted and tired in a long time, so he passed out as soon as an invincible ogre appeared on the horizon. The monster ran towards the man, intending to crush him with its fist. It roared deafeningly. The thing is, the ogre had trouble seeing small objects, and he hit the ground at random, making a huge crater in it. The ogre opened its mouth and growled, lowering itself to look at the man's body. But his roar was cut off, as what he saw made even such a monster surprised. The crater was empty. There was a cry from another human being who was cursing loudly. The monster turned around abruptly, and Taehyung materialized behind him, holding Hyunsu by the collar with one hand. He didn't even wake up, but when he woke up, he grinned, looking at the monster while the beast's tentacles enveloped them. There was a knock on the door of the Huang family, and the man and woman opened the door to the guest and cried out in shock. A slightly embarrassed Taehyung stood at the door, asking how his aunt and uncle were doing, and their son Jae looked happy and alive, excitedly greeting his parents. The elderly couple burst into tears at the same time, and the woman even covered her mouth with her hands to keep from sobbing out loud. As soon as they came to their senses, they began asking the boys what had happened, because they thought that they had died, and the house was in chaos. Jae kept trying to convince his parents that everything was fine and nothing had happened, citing Taehyung, but he only laughed it off. The news on the mobile phone screen calmed the population. The presenter spoke of a huge breakthrough in the gates after 10 years. According to government statements, the current threat of a gate breach has been completely eliminated. In anticipation of a further outbreak, the government ordered nearby schools to close for a week. Also, the survivors have begun to successfully recover, and the public can breathe a sigh of relief. Nayan still didn't understand how she ended up at home and told the police that she had miraculously fallen asleep and ended up back at her place. Hensu, in his hospital pajamas, fought off journalists, shouting at the top of his lungs to the residents that it wasn't he who defeated the giant ogre. The real hero was another man. But since the body of the giant ogre was not found, and the identity of the villain who attacked the people is not known for certain, people are concerned about the insufficient security measures. Listening to the latest news, Taehyung was pleased and soon turned it off. It was enough for him that there was not a word about him there. The guy was somewhere in the forest on the railroad late in the evening, a smile never leaving his lips. Now he had to move on to the next step. He was standing at a dark, long tunnel. The awakened one now had 3 skills, and getting stealth was especially fortunate, but at the current level it was too difficult to use all 3 skills at once. Using it foolishly will drain all your mana and also increase your fatigue level, which will end up pretty badly. And the best solution would be to purchase potions, elixirs created for various purposes, for example, to restore mana or fatigue. But they were expensive, so he needed to earn money, which is why Taehyung was here. He made his way through narrow corridors to hunt. He needed official permission. After all, even simply using skills without permission is considered illegal. There was only one thing left to do: clear out the unexplored dungeons. Now the guy came across a spider's lair. 3 huge female spiders with female bodies of rank B, seeing the man, were surprised by such an impudent act. One of them chuckled and suggested paralyzing Taehyung and building a feast. The guy shook his head. B rank isn't enough to change his rank. Do I really have to kill 100 of them? Hearing this, the Spider Sisters went berserk. They growled furiously, rushing towards the man who did not exactly understand the situation he found himself in. They puffed out their cheeks, preparing to release a web from the depths of their bodies at the awakened one. A huge ball of deadly web flew from 3 mouths at the boy. The sisters intended to eat him alive. They laughed, asking how the man felt now, whether he felt his body turning to stone. But their plans were not destined to come true. The predator helped Taehyung gain resistance. The trio gasped, stepping back as they saw the uninvited guest's grin, and he playfully announced that their skill would be useful to him. Women's screams were heard from the tunnel. They begged Taehyung to wait and spare them. Then the wind carried away the screams of pain and the sounds of spider flesh being torn apart. The system announced victory in the hunt and the registration of the new skill, paralysis. The gleaming windows of the skyscraper shone in the midday sun as the new South Korean Players Association took up residence. The main doors, in traditional Korean style, were guarded by 2 stern guards. In the office, a smiling girl with short hair was calmly drinking tea and talking with 2 men. One, he had noticeable gray hair and sat with his head resting on his clasped hands, looking around at his interlocutors. The second one was younger, Go Tae-wook, the deputy manager and human resources specialist of the new South Korean Players Association, swallowing nervously for some reason, with 2 of the association's best players next to him. Players were those awakened who were allowed to use their skills for various purposes. For example, training in the abyss, clearing dungeons. There are currently 5 centers for such players in South Korea. The largest Korean guilds, the 4 great guilds, the fighters, indivisible. Also masters, alchemists, magicians, wizards. These could control any element. Last but not least were the Nightwalkers' informants. And the authorized agency managing the players, including the 4 great guilds, is the new South Korean Players Association. Now it's clear why Tae-wook, sitting in front of seemingly ordinary people, was so nervous. The girl was the leader of the Nightwalkers Guild and an S-rank player, UN. She winked, greeting the person across from her, whom she hadn't seen for a long time. Ji Jinwi, the chairman of the new South Korean Players Association and an S-rank player, looked at Een like a predator and thanked her for her visit despite his busy schedule. He immediately got down to business, asking if the girl had learned anything, and she immediately clarified whether they were talking about the Villains Guild. The Villain Guild that Sandro belonged to was a criminal organization founded by the most insane people, even among the villains. The members of this guild wear rings with 3 skulls. Aeon handed over a sheet of paper with the guild's latest movements listed on it, and there was also a list of the players the villains were targeting. The girl leaned back in her chair, twirling a strand of hair in her fingers. She was sure that Jinwi had not called her to personally hand over documents. He took the sheet of paper in his hands and burst out laughing, knowing that nothing could be hidden from the beauty. He paused for a moment and then said that he wanted to know Aen's opinion, which surprised his interlocutor. The man asked her seriously when she had taken the player test, and the girl replied with confusion that she had done it at the age of 19, when she had reached the qualifying age. Suddenly, En stopped short, looking at the strange expression on the chairman's face. Jinwee's lips stretched into a predatory grin. The warrior didn't believe that he would suggest what she was thinking about. And so it happened, the chairman asked if a high school student could fight a monster. At this time, Taehyung was sitting on a high mountain of spider remains and with a backpack full of crystals, calling the Alchemist Guild, one of the 4 great guilds. The guy held the phone in one hand, saying that he wanted to buy some potions, and with the other he clutched a huge and bright diamond. Finally, the 7-day school closure due to the gate breach is over. During these 7 days, Taehyung and Jae worked hard on their physical training, almost never letting go of the dumbbells. The elder also went on his own to clear the dungeon and fight monsters. After some time, he finally arrived at the headquarters of the Alchemist's Guild to hear surprised exclamations at the number of magic stones. When Taehyung dumped his entire catch in front of the employees, they cried out in amazement, promising to take him to SVIP to make a deal with the alchemist. The guy needed to buy potions, get a mana stone, and increase his rank. But the most unpleasant thing he had to do was go to school. Taehyung sat alone at his desk, surrounded by the piercing glances of his classmates. They didn't dare come closer, talking among themselves. There were rumors that he single-handedly defeated Hex's henchmen. But no matter how hard he tried, the schoolboy still had big problems. Taehyung would have continued to ignore the whispers, but suddenly he heard steps in his direction. Only this made the schoolboy distract himself from contemplating the schoolyard through the window. At that moment, the desks and chairs standing in his path were overturned, and there was a loud crash. Several unfamiliar guys appeared in the office, and they didn't look too friendly. Someone sat down on the chair in front of Taehyung and threw their long legs and their changeable slippers right onto his desk. It was the awakened S-rank Lee Jung-jae himself, the one who was feared by the students who were discussing his classmate. It seemed like there was a flame burning behind this man. He was clearly dissatisfied with something. With his hands in his pockets, John Jae greeted someone he hadn't seen for a long time. The leader of the Daesun High School gang, a third-generation chaebol of the Daesun Company, a large corporation that sponsors Daesun High School. But what's most important for Taehyung is that this bastard bullied him repeatedly in his past life. He and his cowardly friends cornered a weaker and unawakened guy in the gateways to beat him up. John Jae always stood nearby, grinning mockingly while his dirty work was done for him. He was also the main culprit who set Hexa on Taehyung just because the guy wasn't awakened. But now, looking at the stranger's feet in front of him, the guy didn't even raise an eyebrow, asking why on earth they were addressing him so freely. The beast inside the schoolboy awakened and he shouted for John Jae to get lost. One of the gang leader's henchmen immediately pointed his finger at the offender, calling him a bastard. But he immediately received a punch in the nose, which broke it until it bled from his own leader. He stood up from his chair, kicking the small fry with his foot, reminding him that he should not be disturbed during the conversation. He returned to his conversation with Taehyung, who was still sitting in his place. A strange aura hung around John Jae when he spoke about Taehyung's encouragement after defeating Hexu. Suddenly, the chaebol stood up, his eyes blazing with a bright flame, towering over the schoolboy, warning that the enemy should not be teased by looking him in the face. Taehyung looked at the flames raging around John Jae's figure, amazed by the overwhelming magical power of the awakened S-class. Thin streaks of fire reached out to the guy. Their owner wanted to make the bastard learn respect and listen carefully when important things are said. But Taehyung already felt the predator in his hands. He was interested in the meeting of these two forces, but he was unable to verify what he wanted because a cold female voice, matching the appearance of its owner, asked John Jae to leave. The girl, without even turning around, deftly intercepted the hand of the chaebol's accomplice, which was about to dig into her shoulder, and it, accompanied by cries of pain, became covered in a crust of ice. Lim Ayong glanced around at those present, stopping at Taehyung, and she also advised him to finish. Seeing the unexpected guest, the guy's spirits perked up, and a smile appeared on his face even in such circumstances. This girl had many titles: school president, rich girl, Yu Ayan's half-sister, S-class awakened, model student, future SS rank player. Also the nobility of Oblige, the most promising in her circle. She has so many nicknames, and there will be even more names. But now this schoolgirl intended to stop the upcoming fight between the boys. She walked right up to the impudent chaebol John Jae and looked him in the eyes without fear, even though she was shorter than him. He laughed, saying that there was a misunderstanding, because now one can just observe an ordinary conversation between friends. The girl didn't react to this lie in any way. She only mockingly asked if friends really get punched in the face. The guy smiled differently. His eyes lit up with a warning red. He asked not to cross the line. Ayan looked calmly and confidently, her blue eyes fixed on the face opposite her. She promised to help him leave if Jia didn't do it himself, so let him drop everything and go away. Taehyung looked at the two flaring waves of elements and mana hovering around the guy with his mouth slightly open. If they continued, they would destroy half the class. Jeonjae fell silent, holding his head high and looking at the girl from under his lowered eyelashes. Ayeon fearlessly met the murderous gaze without even blinking. She also remained silent. A few seconds passed and Jeonjae was the first to retreat. He turned towards the door, waving his finger, saying that he was not going to waste his energy on a fight. But one could not expect submission from such a man. He shouted that such words were expected from him. Then he turned around abruptly, intending to throw a stream of deadly fire from his magic at the girl. The intercom beeped. On the second note, Ayeon also froze. She was also ready to accept the attack, freezing the sphere. Taehyung, who still hadn't gotten up from his chair, stared intently at the speaker on the classroom wall from which the melody was heard. After a few short bars, a melodic female voice announced a minute of attention. The broadcast department spoke. The Players Association will hold a special lecture in the main hall. All students must immediately gather in the main hall. The voice kept repeating that it was important, and it was about the Players Association. Hearing this, Jeonji lowered his hand with the sphere and repeated with his lips what he had said earlier. The guy's face showed uncertainty for just a moment, but he was able to quickly hide it. He looked at Ayeon, who was gesturing for him to come over to fight. The chaebol raised an eyebrow and smirked, hissing that the announcement had come at the right time. This time he actually turned around to leave, calling his henchmen after him. The guy added that the rest were very lucky. Ayeon seemed not to even hear these words as she froze strangely in a warlike pose. There was a knock. She turned to Taehyung to check his condition. The warrior had barely asked not to thank her when she discovered that the guy had disappeared from his place. He was already at the door, asking Ayeon over his shoulder why she froze, whether she hadn't heard the announcement about the gathering in the main hall. Without waiting for an answer, he shrugged his shoulders and said that he would go first. When the door slammed behind the guy, Ayeon's mouth opened in shock. No one had ever treated her like that before. After some time, all the school children actually gathered in the main hall. Everyone was wondering what the special lecture organized by the Players Association would be about. Was it really organized because of the gate breach? The students were greeted by the Deputy Director of Human Resources of the Hero Association, Go Tae-wook. The man at the lectern explained the reasons for the meeting. One was the lack of response to the gate breach, an apology, and safety training from the Players Association. Just as Tae-wook was about to tell about the second reason, the mana around his figure noticeably changed. The seething purple energy echoed its master, who, with a predatory look, informed about changes to the player exam for those students responsible for the future of New Korea. Jeonjae, hearing this, cursed quietly, calling Taehyung a real bastard. Ayeon, who was standing nearby, was biting her fingertips. She was also thinking about Taehyung, thinking that she would need to find out about him later. The subject of other people's thoughts was sitting in the hall and openly yawning from boredom. The other students looked at each other, not understanding what this had to do with them, since this exam was for 19-year-olds, and they wouldn't be able to participate this year. Tae-wook heard the youth's voices and said that the information was related to the students, which is why he came here to give recommendations. Recently, an unexpected event occurred. The gates were broken through, and now the number of monsters and dungeons has increased dramatically. The man leaned both hands on the podium and announced that the Players Association acknowledged the shortage of personnel, and, therefore, starting this year, there are plans to start receiving recommendations even from high school students. The students almost jumped out of their seats when they realized what they had heard, and the hall buzzed like a beehive. Tae-wook talked about each school's guidelines, which included testing abilities, grades, and behavior, and knew they were being blatantly lied to, especially about selecting people based on complete numerical data. And although the deputy manager said that only high school students could take the exam, the selection was already underway, right now. After all, Tae-wook had an interesting skill hidden in his aiming gaze. He was able to identify the strongest with the eye of an observer, a kind of camera, the ability to quantify the total number of abilities of the person you're looking at, and even see the player's status window information when concentrating. Tae-wook smiled at the corners of his lips as he wanted to clarify something for the children. He thought that the numbers here were definitely better than elsewhere. These school children would become great players. And most importantly, the man had been eyeing the two most amazing students at this school for a long time. Fire mana and flame magic raged under Jeonji's undisguised evil gaze. Ice Princess A Young also showed good promise. In some ways, she even surpassed the chaebol. Tuuk received a list of recommended targets from the Nightwalkers, but those are large numbers for an unprepared awoken. The man thought that he would have to write a letter of recommendation upon returning to the association, and he turned to the students with a grin. But he was not allowed to finish. To everyone's delight, Johnza raised his hand, asking for the attention of the gentleman player. He did not expect at all that anyone would dare to interrupt him, and silently stared at the student whom he had noticed earlier. The guy paid attention to the deputy chairman's words. He said he would provide recommendations for replacing a player. So, are there any who are completely unsuitable for the position? After all, the player exam is a test to determine whether any of the awakened have the right to become a player. He glanced slyly at Tae-hyung, who was standing nearby, picking him out from the crowd with just one glance, and said loudly that the unawakened did not need to hear this. You might think that a player's main advantage is his strength, but the point was completely different. Of course, the rank of an awakened being, the ability to deal with various situations, and extensive knowledge of the abyss, all these complex abilities must be tested to become eligible to become a player. John Jay continued, saying that the first difficulty is awakening. He looked at Tae-hyung again, mockingly suggesting that the unawakened might be hurt by hearing this, and laughter was heard after such words. The guy didn't want to give in to provocations, but immediately assumed that by saying such a thing, the chaebol clearly wanted to check whether his classmate was awakened. He looked at Tae-hyung with disdain. Indeed, if he was awakened, he should quickly prove it. At that moment, Ayeon couldn't stand it. Turning around, she angrily called out John Jay's name. Tae-hyung rolled his eyes and looked at the girl unkindly, because he didn't need unsolicited help. Ayeon blushed slightly under their gaze, but shaking her head, she decided that she didn't care anymore. Let them sort it out themselves. Tevuk, after thinking for a moment, replied that he understood what the student was talking about, but that attendance at this lecture was entirely up to the students. John Jay wasn't going to remain silent. He turned everyone's attention back to Tae-hyung, loudly asking if he could unawakened get a recommendation. Or maybe the guy wants to say that he doesn't care at all about things like testing players. If Tae-hyung can't clearly prove that he is awakened, then there will be no chance of passing the exam. The guy smiled because he knew that he didn't have to prove himself in person to get a recommendation. He knew about the deputy chairman's skill, and he actually saw two with abilities among the dark figures, and a little later a third, Tae-hyung himself. However, his expectations regarding John Jay were not met. Although the guy had an S rank, he was a simple hooligan and did not fit in. But Tae-hyung, in the opinion of the students, was unawakened, with an unknown potential level. Just as the man wanted to touch the boy with invisible threads of ability, the system suddenly announced that it was impossible to confirm the information. The deputy chairman stepped back in shock. This had never happened before, and at that moment, Tae-hyung's voice was heard, addressing the chaebol, saying that he was right in his judgment. What is the use of listening to such information for the unawakened? It will only hurt John Jay's pride in vain. Tae-hyung took a deep breath and turned to his puzzled classmate. To everyone's surprise, he showed him the middle finger, firmly saying that he was leaving the lecture. Well, let the chaebol stay and listen to the end after such an act. John Jay grimaced, calling the guy a bastard. But Tuuk seemed oblivious to the quarrel, still preoccupied with his own failure. What caused the most misunderstanding was that he had used his abilities on different people before. Even with the association president and the guild leader N, there were never any problems. The students parted and Tae-hyung silently walked through the living corridor. He no longer paid attention to the looks, not even feeling the harshest of them, John Jay's look, on himself. Tuuk still couldn't come to his senses. It was as if he had been doused with ice water and made to doubt his own strength. Tae-hyung continued walking towards the door in complete silence, without even turning around. But the man tested his ability on him in vain. The system did not give any other answers. Again and again, impossible. But now Tae-hyung suddenly turned around sharply, staring at Tuuk, as if he knew everything about him. And only at that moment did the man see the light, realizing that the boy had simply allowed himself to be seen. There was something incredibly, deafeningly powerful in front of him. And the guy himself possessed remarkable strength. He was clearly more gifted than Ayeon. The next day, when he arrived at school, Tae-hyung went straight to the library. He had been studying various literature for a long time and was quite tired when he noticed shadows approaching him. Tae-hyung had been thinking about using his free time to search for clues about the king, but it seemed he wouldn't be able to do that. Jonja's henchman blocked his path but did not touch him, apparently having received orders from the boss. One of the guys, the one his boss had hit, arrogantly and with a hint of fear demanded that he follow them because John Jay was looking for the guy. Tae-hyung decided to tease the rascals, and although he could no longer concentrate on reading, He lazily turned the page, stating that he didn't really want to go. But the guys weren't so simple. One with a broken nose grinned and asked if Taehyung ran his aunt's restaurant. These words made the guy suddenly lose interest in the book, and he couldn't hide his surprise. He raised his head and almost dropped the textbook on the floor, to which he was told that this was what John Jay had asked him to give. The accomplice smirked, finding Taehyung's weak spots, saying that he doesn't have parents, that his aunt has a hard time, and does her nephew really want to make her life even more difficult? When the bastard laughed, closing his eyes and saying that he would make Taehyung go anyway, he didn't have time to notice something flying into his face. The door to the library was blown to pieces by the explosion. Even the wall was damaged. Many shelves were found lying on the ground, the books were charred, and the bloody accomplice was suffocating. Taehyung had long since stood up and was now holding the bastard by the neck with one hand, lifting him into the air. The rest lay unconscious on the floor, their eyes rolled back. Now madness was splashing in Taehyung's eyes. He demanded not to be forced to repeat it twice, and to finally answer where John Jay was now. Having knocked the answer out of the half-dead student, Taehyung went to the school gym, where they were already waiting for him. Next to the self-confident John Jay stood a tall man in a suit, the guy's bodyguard. He used the skill on Taehyung, but reported that something amazing had happened. Sol Hundo, an A-rank hunter, had already used a status-reducing skill several times since the person he needed arrived. The man cried out that he couldn't do anything, and if Taehyung had such a level of resistance, then he was probably an A-rank awakened being. John Jay chuckled when he heard this news and immediately suggested that they talk as friends. Taehyung only gritted his teeth and said nothing, amazed at the insolence of his opponent. He said that he was harsh, but in fact he did not intend to harm Taehyung. He wanted to find out about him as soon as possible. The boy smiled and said that after finishing his studies he would create a guild that would become the successor to Taesun. But even a genius like him couldn't do everything alone. Taehyung only gritted his teeth and said nothing, amazed at his opponent's impudence. John Jay gave a thumbs up, saying that he needed people who weren't losers like Heksu, but truly talented ones. And his choice fell on Taehyung. It was he who now acted as such a person. Like a movie hero, the rich man spread his arms and laughed, urging his classmate to forget old grievances and join him. The flame of madness burned in his eyes. John Jay promised wealth and glory, and even the guy's family would be able to escape from poverty. The flow of unnecessary words was interrupted by Taehyung. He said that it sounded like complete nonsense. The hypocrite's fiery speech truly angered the awakened one, so much so that stone plates began to appear on his face. Then his entire torso and arms were covered in hard rock. Taehyung exclaimed that the impudent fellow had crossed the line. No one had ever refused or interrupted John Jay, so the guy fell silent, stunned. After a few seconds of silence, he chuckled and lowered his head, agreeing with his interlocutor. But the next moment, the flames of his ability's fire scorched the room, and the guy announced that he would now explain in detail what he meant. Hundo immediately dropped to one knee and placed his palms on the floor, activating his ability. He used a special magic, hiding space. The entire room was covered with an invisible grid. Space, a barrier skill that surrounds the space with a shield. The man shook his palms, as now the magical forces inside the shield could not be sensed from the outside, and the entire school would not know about the fight. As soon as he asked where to start the check, his master already rushed towards Taehyung. The same one jumped almost to the ceiling and, with his jaw clenched in anger, directed a stone fist at the enemy. The same one, smiling madly, rushed towards him in a similar manner, clutching a fiery sphere in his fist. As the boys got closer to each other, the small stream of flame transformed into something much larger, separating the students. The stone and the flame collided with each other in a powerful two-fist strike. The flames burned Taehyung's skin fiercely, and he clenched his teeth to curse. The guy managed to jump back from the new attack, but still, John Jay received less damage. The rich student's next attack almost proved fatal for Taehyung. The fiery explosion in the middle of the room was incredibly powerful. Burned Taehyung alive, he coughed up blood, greedily gulping air. Diverting fire slightly towards John Jay laughed, asking if Taehyung now understood everything. Hundo stood silently, his hands in his pockets, enjoying the sight of 1,000 fiery flashes. The flames didn't touch him. The man pursed his lips, thinking that he felt sorry for Taehyung in his own way. Probably an awakened A rank with high body strengthening skills. With such a level of combat sense and willpower, it's hard to believe that he's still a high school student. He probably usually can't even find an opponent, but today's battle exceeded the expectations of everyone present. John Jay, an incredible S-rank awakened being, nearly destroyed the enemy. Hundo shook his head, mentally advising Taehyung to learn his lesson and give up. But suddenly the man froze, and not a single thought came into his head from what he saw. John Jae continued to force Taehyung into the corner with a barrage of blows, and so far he had succeeded. But somehow the guy suddenly regained his spirit, as if he had received nourishment from outside. Now he had taken the lead in this battle, and with animal strength he attacked John Jae. The stone fist crashed tirelessly into the enemy's face, and one of the last blows sent him flying to the side. Hundo didn't expect at all that some brat would throw out his master. The guy lay on the broken wooden floor, breathing heavily from the strain. Purple lightning bolts of rage began to fly around Yoongjai's head. He screamed that Taehyung had no right to touch him, and now he couldn't even move after the attack. The schoolboy's security guard froze in shock, mouthing that his master couldn't get up. Isn't Taehyung's skill limited by armor? What kind of person is he? And although blood was streaming down the guy's face and he himself was wounded, he stood firmly on the floor, clenching his stone fist, and exclaimed that he had finally succeeded. There are 3 skills in total that Taehyung acquired thanks to the Predator: Stone Skin, Invisibility. And then, having cleared the tunnel, he took the Spider Paralysis from the sisters. However, the Awakened One did not use all of his skills from the start. C-rank paralysis cannot easily overcome S-rank resistance. Invisibility is quickly broken by a wide range of fire attacks. But a Predator is a last resort and should not be resorted to haphazardly. Therefore, Taehyung's goal was to accumulate paralysis in the enemy in close combat. The status reduction skill has a greater effect if it is boosted by a direct hit rather than applied from a distance. If paralysis is inflicted repeatedly with continuous strikes, even with an S-rank enemy resistance, he will not be able to withstand it. The smoke from the recent fire gradually cleared, and Taehyung resolutely headed towards the prone enemy. The Master's Guard also seemed to be under the spell of the Awakened One and was paralyzed. The man thought that what had happened was incredible, because the schoolboy had defeated the gentleman in a direct confrontation, which exceeded all expectations. Taehyung himself stood silently, bending over the defeated enemy, looking at him attentively. He was conscious and began to whisper something with dry lips, saying that he knew something. In response to the surprised look, the guy replied with a smile that he had underestimated Taehyung. Otherwise, he wouldn't have been beaten by such trash. John Z held a small crystal in his hands and kept saying that now he could do the same. The next moment he squeezed the stone hard, and it crumbled into many pieces in his palm. Taehyung gasped, leaning back, something terrible unfolding before his eyes. It was as if some force had lifted John Jae into the air, and a fiery skeleton as tall as the ceiling grew above the guy. The guy laughed, covering his face with his disfigured palm, and said that now he too would be a worthy opponent. Taehyung immediately turned to run, and this entire fiery mass rushed after him. The skeleton, controlled by John Z, obeyed its master without question and quickly reached for its victim. Taehyung managed to jump back when a huge fire sphere fell at his feet. His fist also grew in size, hanging over the skeleton in its awakening. Focusing on the upcoming blow, Taehyung directed his stone hand forward. The skeleton's mouth opened and a stream of fire poured into the air from its dark interior. Despite this, Taehyung still fearlessly approached the monster. The stone fist heated up as it made its way through the streams of bright flame. The temperature was so high that the stone could not withstand it and cracked, revealing human skin. Another explosion seemed to split the room into several parts. Taehyung fell down from a height. He fell to the floor, then leaned on his elbows. John Jae and the skeleton leaned over the guy. Hundo knew that this was the master's skill, the true form of Blazing Heart. In his normal form, it would be difficult to reveal the true power of the S-class. But before that, the gentleman used one thing: a magic enhancement stone. The magic stone is the heart of a monster, as it was also called, a product obtained through processing. It temporarily enhances magical power, giving the wearer the ability to emerge victorious from the game. If Hundo was right, then his master was now capable of unleashing his S-rank power to its full potential. Still, the man knew that there were problems with this too, and he rushed towards the guy. The guard knew about the gentleman's temperament and shouted at him to stop, as he could even kill Taehyung. Moreover, the magical power is too strong for the guy. He won't be able to cope. His blood vessels will burst due to the leakage of magical energy. A fiery arrow instantly flew at the place where the man stood. Launched by the irritated words of the guard John Zae, he jumped to the side, letting out a muffled cry, avoiding being torn to pieces by the explosion. The guy, meanwhile, had almost lost his face. He was gradually turning into a fiery chimera. Seeing how Taehyung understood Yoongjai, he ordered him to shut up. It was impossible to stop. The battered but still alive awakened man raised his head sharply. The huge one flew off and shouted in the voice of a classmate that he couldn't be given orders, throwing fire spheres. Even the owner himself no longer understood where he was or what was happening, having completely dissolved in the sea of fire. Jongjai's face was already crumbling from the high temperatures. He was screaming furiously, wishing Taehyung death. Hundo was sure that the master had gone crazy and was wondering how to stop him. He ran to the hole in the floor where the sphere had hit and called out to Taehyung, urging him to stop fighting and run. The man crawled to the edge and extended his hand to help the boy out, saying that he would somehow stop the gentleman. But instead of gratitude, he received a solid punch to the jaw. This attack literally knocked the strong guard off his feet. He flew back several meters, coughing up blood. An angry Taehyung was heading towards him from the smokescreen, and he had no intention of running away. Of course, he recognized the S rank, but he himself was prepared for battle. He took a lot of recovery potion with him. The boy restored his mana and magic, preparing to become himself again. Now the predator has awakened. In the office of the new South Korean Players Association, Chairman Jinwee sat at the head of the table listening to Taewook's report. Hearing the level of power of the awakened beings revealed, the man couldn't help but scream. The speaker nodded, having seen it with his own eyes. Jonjae has 1,900, Aeon has 2,300. Both are confirmed S-rank awakened. The assistants looked through the documents and were amazed at the wealthy student's strength, comparable to that of an A-rank hunter and the Japanese saint. Jinwee laughed joyfully. Could it be that now even in New Korea there was a saint-level hunter? Saint. As one of the hunters representing Japan, the girl was 19 when she first tested her level and turned out to be a monster whose total points exceeded 2,500. And even the monster's number was only. That's not enough. Taewook couldn't get Taehyung's numbers out of his head. There were more than 5,000 of them. With a serious face, he walked towards the exit of the office, wondering whether it was a mistake or an illusion. He knew for sure that he had to find out for himself. Hundo looked ahead and trembled all over, not believing in the reality of what was happening. He sank to his knees, muttering that it was impossible for a human. This time, Taehyung's avatar, a huge bloody knight, appeared as tall as the fiery skeleton. He was completely submissive to the schoolboy, who, as it turned out, had no intention of giving up. Turning around its axis, the monster opened its huge mouth, releasing the tentacles of the predator. In response to this, Jonjae became incredibly angry, directing more and more streams of fire. Even his clothes were scorched. All because a bastard like Taehyung rejected him, the heir of the Daesung group, an S-rank player. He wanted to say something else but began to choke, greedily gasping for air. Then, gathering the remnants of his mind, he loudly shouted his name, but at that moment he was already under attack from Taehyung. He shrugged his shoulders. The guy didn't care about the opponent's rank and his regalia. Taehyung smirked, red flashing in the pupils of his eyes. Struck by the refusal and hurt in his heart, Jonjae cried out desperately. He suddenly saw not Taehyung but a real deity who controlled the elements. The guy stepped back in horror, instantly falling silent. Taehyung told him that he possessed the power of a king. Jonta couldn't run away. He couldn't hide. The predator's tentacles were immediately directed at him from all sides. The gentleman's eyes widened in silent shock. He no longer had the strength to scream. The part of the building where the two strong players were fighting was engulfed in flames, which started after a deafening explosion. Jonjae lay on the ground, finally defeated and trampled in this battle. Hundo, rejected but loyal, slowly approached him on stiff legs. But Taehyung was very surprised when the man passed his master and walked towards him, falling to his knees. The guard bowed his head, admitting that he was incredibly surprised. A rank player Hundo didn't expect to pull out young Jai under such conditions using Predator. It didn't matter. Since Taehyung had already taken the skill, the man asked what he was thinking about. After all, his master is the heir of Taesun. How is the student going to deal with the consequences? Taehyung chuckled. He wasn't the one who started the fight, and anyway, did he really look like someone who would be scared by all this? But the guard shouldn't worry, because the young master won't be killed. In return, the awakened one wanted to receive payment for Ji's life. Hearing that Mr. Heir of Taesun, Hundo turned cold, realizing what his interlocutor was leading to. Taehyung stretched his lips into a smile, deliberately slowly scratching his chin. His eyebrows shot up. The guy suggested that he could get 1 billion for John Jay. The cracked part of the school was burning, and evacuated students stood nearby with a teacher trying to calm them down. Everyone was asked to move even further away, the shocked students whispered, wondering what was happening there. Maybe it was an attack by a demon or a monster. But Lim felt magic and a powerful flame and was sure that it was the power of John Jay. But she could not understand who his opponent was. The girl imagined John Jay waving his fire, threatening to kill, and Taehyung begging for someone to save him. The teacher was telling the students that since they were here on the street, they were not in any danger. At that moment, Lim rushed forward towards the school, and no one could stop her. The girl was sure that now only she could stop this fight with unequal chances. The student thought about how wrong she had been by not checking the gym. The girl was sure that it was her fault that this was happening. She only prayed for Taehyung to be alive. However, it was worth praying for someone completely different. Upon entering the room, Lim found tongues of flame playing, among which stood a battered Taehyung in front of an unconscious John Jay lying on the floor. The guy noted that the schoolgirl had arrived just in time. He needed a witness, but then he stopped himself and explained that he needed someone to take John Jay to the medical center, or better yet, straight to the hospital. The girl lowered herself down and placed the unconscious student on her leg, asking what had happened here, and Taehyung replied that the student had already been lying here alone. Perhaps he had fallen down the stairs or something like that. This assumption seemed implausible to Lim, and the guy said that he still didn't know what happened, and asked the girl not to tell anyone that she had seen him there too. Taehyung hurried away, and the student demanded that he stop and explain everything properly. However, when Lim turned around, there was no one around. She was confused, not understanding how the guy could disappear so quickly, as if he had never been there. Taehyung was already far from the school, on a hill from which one could see smoke rising from the gym in the rays of the setting sun. The guy was sure that Lim would take care of John Jay, and Tess and group also shouldn't bother him, which meant the issue was resolved. But he didn't understand some things that appeared in the system window after this battle. He gained Charm and Monarch's Heart, which increased the abilities of party members. Taehyung felt like Charm was something that only related to appearance, like celebrities. He couldn't understand how something like that could even come through his window when John Jay's power was absorbed. Maybe his luck had turned against him? Moreover, the skill he acquired was not called Flaming Heart, but Monarch's Heart. Taehyung was surprised that Lee even had such a skill. But for the guy, it was even good. Skills that affected the entire party were rare, regardless of their level. Since Taehyung had several skills, he could combine them. But Monarch's Heart was much better. The guy was very happy about this turn of events. However, this joy quickly gave way to bewilderment as 3 black cars drove up to the schoolboy. The barking of dogs was heard, people got out of cars, one of whom noted that Taehyung had finally been found. It was Taevuk, who had a few questions for the student. The nervous guy didn't understand why this man was here now. Go asked what Taehyung did in the gym. A red path through the garden, illuminated by tall street lamps, led to the mansion. Inside was a man holding a whiskey on the rocks, thinking about how things had turned out. His only son was in the hospital, but as if that wasn't enough, the man had to pay $1 billion in compensation for his life. The man, flanked by Dobermans barking menacingly, asked Hundo, who was shaking with terror and begging for forgiveness, if he could handle it. Hundo looked at the floor, sweat dripping from his face. The bodyguard was ready to carry out any order. Hundo was shocked when, instead of punishing him, his boss allowed him to act as he saw fit. The conglomerate noted that Taehyung was quite cheeky, which was even funny. However, no matter how much they had to pay, they should also have received compensation. The boss snapped his fingers and Hundo cowered as the dogs approached him. The bodyguard did not agree with such injustice, trying to convince the conglomerate. Hundo said that John Z's opponent was still a very young boy, and it was ruthless. The boss ordered the bodyguard to be silent, as he did not allow the dog to bark. Lee Jong-soo was the CEO of Thiessen Group and an S-rank hunter. Standing in front of Taewook, Taehyung wondered how this had happened. The student couldn't understand what exactly Go was talking about, maybe about the explosion or the situation during the lecture. Taewook was the deputy director of the association. The chances that he would personally visit the scene of the fire were slim, but still, this person might already know that Taehyung was the culprit and make his move. To understand the reason for this man's appearance here, the guy decided to check on him and asked if the man had spoken about the explosion in the gym. Go didn't immediately understand what they were talking about, because it wasn't what he was really interested in. Taewook explained that other people were supposed to deal with the fire behind him. Having received no answer to his question, the deputy asked again what Taehyung was doing at the gym. Realizing that Go didn't know about the explosion, the student smiled slyly. The student asked if the man was unaware. Taewook asked what he was talking about, and Taehyung explained that the deputy was supposed to invite the boy to the hunter's test. Grinning, Go asked on what basis he had to do that. The student then released his sinister energy, allowing his potential to be seen, and asked if that wasn't enough of a reason. The people standing in front of him were amazed. They could not believe that such a thing was possible. In a very short time, Taehyung had become even stronger, which meant that the number above his head was neither a coincidence nor a mistake. Twook wondered who this young man was. He also asked why the schoolboy's clothes were so dirty. When Taehyung returned home, Jaeyoung learned that his brother would be taking the hunter exam. Bursting into the room, the guy asked if Taehyung was really going to turn him in, and the young man who was lifting a dumbbell replied that it would happen in a month. Jaeyoung froze, his mouth hanging open in surprise. The cousin began to actively bow, calling the high school student a king and deifying him, and Taehyung considered it a joke. Taehyung was confident that the Daesun group would take care of the gym incident, and Taewook's suspicions would likely be dispelled. The exam was only in a month, so the guy could focus on training. The schoolboy had just thought that there shouldn't be any more problems when suddenly the phone rang. Also at that moment, there were 3 people on the roof opposite Taehyung's house. One of them, wrapped in bandages, his face hidden under a white mask, was strangling a man in a business suit, not content with the fact that for some reason the association's hunter was guarding the house of some pathetic high school student. He talked about how it irritated him. And the second one, in black with torn socks, 3 rings on his lower lip, and a mask like a robber, explained that their target was probably one of those who participated in the upcoming hunter test, because that was how the Hunter Association took care of rising stars. These guys were 2 assassins called Black and White Brother. The elder brother Black was an A-rank villain with stealth and body enhancement skills. The younger brother White was a B-rank villain who only had the stealth skill. He asked how their victim could be a rising star if he was just a child with little experience. Chorney chuckled and replied that even if he was a promising hunter without enough experience, he was a non-entity. The elder brother declared that they would show everyone what true awakened ones are. Turning around, Black saw how someone was beating his brother, holding his hand up to his throat. The angry man rushed towards the stranger and asked who he was. Then Taehyung abruptly let go of White, and giving the killers his sinister grin, turned to the second opponent. Black's blood gushed out as the young man's knee hit him in the nose. And only after this did the schoolboy answer that he was the very same little thing the men were talking about. A few hours before, Taehyung was in the burning gym and demanded $1 billion for John Jae's life. Hundo said that even if he kept silent about this incident, he could not independently decide matters regarding such large sums of money, which Taehyung knew without him. The high school student wasn't such a bad person that he would hold his subordinates accountable. He just wanted Hundo to simply do his best to reach an agreement. A chain began to form around the student's hand, accompanied by a purple glow, and a black system window appeared in front of him. In case his bodyguard betrayed him, Taehyung decided to make a deal. The Awakened Oath was a way to enter into a contract created by the Awakened using magical power, which, if broken, would result in a permanent random penalty. The guy put forward quite simple conditions. Firstly, along with paying 1 billion won in compensation, Daesun Group had to completely conceal the cause of the explosion in the gym. This condition was met. The news said that the fire in the gymnasium of Daesun Middle School was caused by a gas explosion. Fortunately, there were no casualties. Taehyung's recent call came from Seoul. It was Hundo who alerted the schoolboy to the murderous brothers. According to the terms of the contract, he had to inform Taehyung in advance of any attempts made against him for the purpose of revenge. Black made lunge after lunge, but all these attacks missed the schoolboy. Seizing the moment when his opponent seemed to be open, Taehyung tried to perform an uppercut. However, the blow flew through the air unhindered. Somehow, Black found himself behind the schoolboy and was advancing on him again. The man dropped to the ground in hopes of neutralizing his target, but all that was hit was the roof. Taehyung noted that, according to rumors, the Black and White brothers' specialty was sneak attacks using invisibility. As the student thought, there was nothing outstanding about them. The senior student loomed over the killer from behind, causing him to feel fear. Taehyung said that apparently he had already seen everything they were capable of. The city was enveloped in a dark night, through which light from windows and headlights of cars driving along the highway tried to break through. In one of these black cars was UN, who had heard that the selection of participants for the hunter's exam had ended, which was supposed to gather promising hunters from all over the country. While speaking to the chairman on the phone using an earpiece, the woman asked who he expected to see there, probably Shin Yun-bok from Busan S rank. Of course, this man was magnificent, but it was not him that Jinhui wanted to see. In fact, Ji was expecting N's younger sister. However, Yu was sure that Lim would not be able to achieve anything in this family, and the chairman noted that the girl was still just as cruel. Jinwei asked if Yu herself was eagerly awaiting that boy, Shin. Anne replied that Ji hadn't yet heard something interesting that intrigued the man. She heard that besides the S-rankers, there was a guy who Tuuk personally came to see. Since he personally intervened, Yu and the chairman were curious about how good this awakened one was. The next opponents were defeated. The killers lay unconscious against the wall. Taehyung didn't understand why he couldn't use his ability again. The system alerted him that the boy had a physical disability, and that the overload made it impossible to use the predator. Not a single star could be seen in the sky, and only one street lamp lit the street. In front of the bound brothers were hunters. One was outraged that these black and white brothers not only dared to contact a member of the association, but also tried to attack a high school student, while the second noted that these villains had become too much of a gangster lately. Go thanked Taehyung for alerting them to the killers and asked if he had any ideas on who might be behind it. As he pondered the question, the student glanced at Tevik, then turned away, lowered his head, and replied that he wasn't sure. The deputy assumed that the list of participants had somehow leaked online and decided to strengthen security for the future hunters. Taehyung understood that if he had involved the Taesun group in this, not only would he not have been able to sort everything out properly, but he would also have put himself at risk. Besides, they weren't that big of a problem. The guy was most worried about his lack of physical capabilities and the inability to use the predator until the reboot was complete. It turned out that the young man could not use his main skill until his physical capabilities were sufficient. Taehyung wondered what was wrong with this ability. All he had to do was increase his characteristics. To increase his rank, the high school student fought monsters or other awakened beings. But to do this, he needed a predator. Apparently, Taehyung only had one option left. Recently, the guy visited the Blackhead Training Center with Jae-young. There they were met by a cheerful girl named Yura, who, out of habit, introduced herself as their guide and handed them registration forms. Winking, she asked how she could help and only then realized that they were school children. Jae-young was confused by the fact that Taehyung continued to confidently move forward, because in order to enroll in this place, you had to meet the criteria and have money. Feeling awkward, Yura explained to the children that it was a training center, but Taehyung still asked to register the two of them. He then handed the girl a black and gold card. The guy asked if that was enough, and Yura was surprised that this high school student had an SVIP card for one of the 4 alchemist guilds. The girl wondered how it ended up in the hands of a simple schoolboy. Perhaps he was a relative of a high-ranking hunter, or was the owner of this card. Yura was worried. She didn't know what to do, because if the girl made the payment and something went wrong, she could have problems. Suddenly, a muscular, red-haired man with a beard and a mohawk appeared behind Yura, in a strange pose. He laughed, noting that the girl seemed to be in a dilemma. The man explained that this wasn't a place you could just pay to enter. The man was Strongest Kangchul, an unawakened B-rank trainer, a rookie killer. He had developed himself and obtained the skill muscle strengthening. Kangchul flexed his muscles, making Jae-young admire him, while Taehyung just looked at him like he was crazy. The coach began to introduce himself loudly, attracting the attention of others, the surrounding men. Seeing this, could only sympathize with the poor schoolchildren. Kangchul noted that everyone trembled when they heard his name, and if the boys left right away, he was ready to forgive them. But Taehyung asked what the weakling was talking about. The coach was unhappy that some young man dared to call him that. Yura and Jae-young became alarmed, realizing that a showdown could no longer be avoided. The man was unhappy that Taehyung imagined himself stronger than the coach. Since Kangchul didn't believe it, the student proposed a bet. The loser would have to pay a membership fee for 1 year. The man claimed that the boy didn't know his place and agreed to the bet. Kangchul and Taehyung were transported to a virtual world teeming with monsters. The coach and the student were in real life, sitting in chairs while members of the center gathered opposite them, watching their actions in the virtual world. Jae-young was worried and asked what it was. The virtual world was very similar to an abyss. Yura explained that it was a virtual training program called Porter. It was a competitive workout that required carrying maximum weight. It was also necessary to defeat the maximum number of B-class monsters and reach the destination in the shortest possible time in a virtual reality completely identical to the abyss. When it came to fighting for supremacy in the training center, this was the most common method, but it was too disadvantageous against the opponent of the strongest Kangchul. The confident man laughed, feeling the excitement. He believed that the schoolboy had challenged him in vain, since an inexperienced boy would hardly have been able to hold out in such a place. Showing off his muscle-enhancing skill, Kangchul struck one of the monsters. The trainer's agility and dexterity were ideal for the virtual porter, and the weight he could lift was on a completely different level. so Kangchul could easily demonstrate his superiority over the schoolboy, killing 2 monsters at a time, or even more. But when the man turned around, he was surprised. Taehyung rushed forward, simultaneously destroying numerous monsters and throwing them aside. Red arrows pointed forward. The guy's path was blocked by monsters. When the schoolboy had cut up his opponents, the arrows turned green and began pointing in the opposite direction. Taehyung confidently moved forward, no matter how many enemies rushed at him. Even when surrounded by many angry creatures, the guy found ways to resist them. His eyes even lit up more with each new wave of monsters. One could definitely say that he enjoyed the battles. Kangchul couldn't keep up with Taehyung. He could only watch as the schoolboy performed a combo, killing 999 monsters in a row. The coach's jaw dropped as he realized how strong some schoolboy was. Everyone was shocked. They didn't expect such an outcome at all, and only Jae-young believed in his brother. Taehyung didn't plan on staying at the center for longer than a month, but the training was definitely amazing, considering the maximum weight training, and turning to Kangchul, the senior said it was pretty good. But now the coach had to pay and leave. It's been 30 days since the hunter exam changes were announced, and the long-awaited day has finally arrived. All those present were excited while listening to the speaker's speech. The girl in the air in the helicopter said, "The Hunters Association stated that this time minors were also invited to participate. People of all ages from all over the country are flocking here to the association's testing center. The most anticipated hunters, the unrivaled in close combat Iron Fist Hong Jungwook of a rank, the owner of excellent combat instincts that even S ranks could not defeat, Druid Lee Gilsang of A rank, unrivaled in Busan, the S-ranked Thunderer Shin Yunbok, and the one who is rumored to have the highest score among those taking the Rising Star Saint test, Lim Aeyong of S rank, and so on. A large number of talented people plan to take part in this exam. One girl in glasses was out of breath, finding herself in front of a huge crowd through which she could hardly get through. Tears were welling up in her eyes because if she didn't report again today, she would be fired. This girl was the new reporter for Psy Economy. Kim had a typing skill of level E, and her goal at the moment was to interview the participants of the Hunter exam. Unfortunately, due to the crowd, she couldn't even take a photo. Kim felt depressed as she knelt down, feeling that with such a pathetic skill, her life was ruined. At that moment, the reporter's attention was drawn to a young man who approached and expressed his indignation at the number of people that was making it difficult for the participants to get through. Kim felt a surge of hope, realizing that this man was exactly what she needed right now. She couldn't believe her own luck, which had given her such a chance that was passing her by. C-rank Hunter exam participant Taehyung was annoyed that he had to somehow move through the crowd. Not wanting to miss this chance, still on her knees, the girl extended her trembling hand to him, begging him to give her an interview. There were still too many people around the testing center. Taehyung finally made it inside, where he was given directions and informed that the exam was supposed to start in a minute. The guy was almost late due to the sudden interview. But the young man did not consider this a mistake, because he had to take care of his reputation in advance. Entering the room he needed, which was tiled and completely unfurnished, the high school student saw a crowd of participants that was no smaller than the one he had to pass through earlier. The source of the light could not be pinpointed here, but the room was quite bright. All the tiles, both on the wall and on the floor, were absolutely identical. The examinees, each wearing a yellow badge, became anxious, wondering what would happen next and why they had all been gathered in this empty, windowless space. Taehyung and Lim noticed each other later. Upon seeing the guy, the girl was shocked, not immediately recognizing the young man, as he had grown in size, becoming more muscular and even somehow taller. The class president asked what happened to his body, and Taehyung replied that he just bulked up a bit. But it didn't seem like a little. The girl heard that he had woken up, but she couldn't understand how so many changes had happened in a month. Lim wanted to ask what Taehyung did to John Jae last time, but she was suddenly interrupted. The slabs ahead suddenly began to glow and revealed examiners greeting the youth who would later carry the future of the new Korea. They explained that this hall was the first round of the test, in which future hunters were to be selected from among the awakened. Each awakened person here had an examination badge with an individual number engraved on it. In this exam, it was necessary to collect 5 badges, including your own, without which the participant was immediately eliminated. It was the so-called fight for the exam badge. The time for it was limited, only an hour. Suddenly, the floor beneath the awakened one's feet began to collapse, frightening them. The entire space changed, moving people both vertically and horizontally. So, the first round of the exam has begun. The speaker's face was emblazoned on almost every cube on which the frightened examinees stood. The first thing the crowd of Awakened decided to do was attack Lim, hoping that together they could deal with her. One of them shouting that if the girl didn't want to be beaten, she should have attacked first. The serious-minded headman hastened to use her power. She launched an ice block at her opponents, causing them to scream, all of which the examiners could see on the screen in the safe zone. The hunters called Lim a future star, as her skills were excellent. But the other participants were not to be trifled with either. Each of them surpassed the previous test participants. However, the examiners were most interested in S-rank Shin Yunbok from Busan. 20 minutes had passed since the start of the test, and not to mention every effective strike, no one could get close to him. While the examiners admired Shin's amazing abilities and wondered who would be better, Yunbok or Lim, Taewook stood at a distance from them. He watched the exam through a separate window. Considering the scores of the seniors, Go could understand the interest of the other hunters in these two awakened ones. However, he himself saw a figure much more interesting. Taewook was sure that Taehyung would easily pass this test. Smiling contentedly, the deputy was eager for this boy to show everyone his strength. Seeing how Taehyung fought, Go was puzzled. The high school student took hits and delivered weak attacks of his own. Knowing the boy's potential, Taewook expected something completely different. Taehyung's opponent was Hong, who was currently using the skill Iron Skin. The high school student only used Stone Skin against him. Go wondered if he had misjudged the boy's capabilities. The deputy couldn't believe that Taehyung was being pressed by an awakened A rank. The high school student didn't dodge a single blow. Suddenly, Taewook found a pattern in this. Taehyung's arms and part of his face were covered in rocks as he ran purposefully towards Hong. The enemy's fist was approaching the high school student, but the young man, looking from under his brows, smiled as if everything was going according to plan. A steel hand touched Taehyung, causing his head to fall back and blood and stones to fly. An indignant Jungkook shouted out that the guy had really decided to challenge him. Hong stated that Taehyung's stone was just a pathetic parody of his steel, and that even if he fought the Iron Fist up close, the boy's blows would never be able to reach him. Hong's eyes widened as Taehyung voiced his displeasure at this chatter. He explained that all this was not just for nothing. The guy's endurance and charm were increased by 1 unit. Even after a month of training, the block on using hunting did not lift. Perhaps Taehyung's stats were still not good enough? One of the training options was to load his body to the maximum. So the best way was to fight to the limit of his abilities, so the guy's training was not yet finished. Taking another blow to the face, Taehyung attacked Hong, applying enough force to make his opponent stagger back, his armor shattering into pieces. Falling to the floor, an astonished Jungkook called the guy a monster. Exhausted, Han wheezed and lost consciousness. Finally, Taehyung was able to get hold of the first foreign badge. At that moment, the excited Taewook laughed madly. Looking up, Go stated that this man was certainly abnormal. The hunters noted that the deputy was quite excited. Apparently, he was very carried away by this testing. Taewook was surprised that Taehyung was training right during a large-scale survival mission. This recklessness of the schoolboy sent goosebumps down Go's spine. However, this could become a problem now. The deputy understood that the young man was doing all this only for the sake of characteristics. But this fight should have greatly exhausted Taehyung. In Go's opinion, it was best for the high school student to recover his stamina and target the weakest participant now. But the boy's next actions shocked Taewook. Finally, Taehyung was noticed by the other examiners, who wondered why such a weakling would decide to go up against one of the strongest awakened in this field. Taehyung stood on one of the cubes near Yunbok, around whom many unconscious bodies had gathered, and electricity hung in the air. Noticing a new opponent, a smug Shin, with his arms folded in front of him, asked who else he was. Yunbok had already managed to get hold of 147 badges. With feigned surprise, Taehyung asked how many badges the enemy had managed to collect and began counting them. Having counted to 9, the young man noted that there were clearly many more than 5. On the platform, thick dust and electricity merged into a single dance. Yunbok actively sent charges at Taehyung, which the boy deftly dodged. Not a single lightning bolt managed to reach Taehyung before he made the jump. Strengthening his leg, the young man flew back to his opponent, nothing stopping him from reaching Shin. But the stone skin on the leg, having met with lightning, still flew apart. Yunbok noted that the high school student was quite quick. However, Shin noted that the enemy could not even see his attack. An earth storm raged across the platform again, obscuring visibility. After striking, Taehyung immediately hurried to increase the distance between him and his opponent and moved to another platform. Shin was not harmed at all by his attack. The young man was already quite tired from this exam. He didn't expect that it would be so difficult with the Thunderer. Powerful lightning surrounded his entire body, blocking all enemy attacks. They also had such a range and destructive power that they could be used both in close combat and at long range. Taehyung kept trying to figure out how to break through this defense, considering that using the Predator was still impossible. Shin asked why Taehyung didn't approach him. Did he really want Yunbok to do it? Without waiting for an answer, Shin lifted himself off the ground and rushed towards the guy. Taehyung managed to dodge the fist coming at him, and then the blow to his leg. So Yunbok decided to engage in close combat, passionately pursuing Taehyung, who was trying to escape from him. As if playing with a cat and a mouse, Shin asked where the enemy had run away from him. This time, Taehyung didn't manage to distance himself in time. Electricity coursed through all his muscles, causing the boy to convulse. Yunbok laughed maliciously, saying that since the opponent wanted a fight, he didn't need to run away. Clenching his jaw, Taehyung remained silent, unable to say anything. But, having finally found the strength within himself, the young man created a stone block around his hand and rushed at Shin. Insulting his opponent, Yunbok destroyed Taehyung's creation with another bolt of lightning. A bright light filled the room, blinding the young man. Shin's attack knocked Taehyung off his feet, causing him to now fall downwards, passing all the platforms. The high school student felt uneasy, realizing that a new wave would soon follow. The next attack was so powerful that it collided with one of the platforms and destroyed it. Feeling pain and covering his eyes with his hands, Taehyung screamed. Shin laughed, surprised that his opponent could endure such a thing. Yunbok thought about how such a difficult person like Taehyung ended up in this place. All this time, the other exam participants were running away from Shin. He thought that the only one who could entertain him during these qualifiers would be Lim. But it turned out that Taehyung was here. Another interesting toy. Suddenly, a stone hit his forehead. Confusing Yunbok, for the first time in this arena his blood was spilled. Shin couldn't understand what had happened. Taehyung was standing on the half-destroyed platform and he threw this stone. Just as Yunbok was thinking that the boy couldn't reach him, the young man swung again, throwing stone shards. Several of these projectiles hit Shin's body, causing him to lose his balance. Yunbok coughed up blood, not understanding how this was possible. Of course, the stone skin could not pierce the wrath of the Thunder God, even when going beyond its limits. Such blows left no trace. But here the examination hall was different. Because it was originally made of a material that could withstand the power of an awakened being, unlike stone skin, it did not lose its properties even if it was crushed. So, if used as a weapon, it was the only way to overcome the wrath of the Thunder God. Taehyung was sure that Yunbok was not his equal. Before being defeated by his opponent's powerful attack, Shin gave him a hearty insult. Besides the lightning striking in all directions, blood was pouring out of Yunbok's mouth, and some of the badges were being torn off his clothes. Not only was Shin injured, but the platform beneath him began to collapse. The examiners gathered around the screen were stunned, unable to understand how a C rank could defeat an S rank. Taewook was still standing behind them, smiling as he thought that only Taehyung had managed to make these people nervous. But now Go also became worried, seeing something on the screen. While Shin lay unconscious, Taehyung collected 3 badges. Since the guy already had the required amount, he was just going to wait for the time to run out. At that moment, an ice floe flew at him, which he miraculously managed to avoid. For Taehyung, encountering ice was a bit of a surprise. Above him, he saw a rather large blue snowflake. It began to spread quickly, turning into thin ice. Gradually, a sphere formed around the platform on which Taehyung was located. Finally, the dome was completed, but its walls continued to thicken. Lim, who was standing opposite the guy, slowly approached him. Taehyung's mouth dropped open in surprise. He hadn't intended to fight the class president in this exam, and he was already running low on strength. The young man wondered why Lim was next to him, and since when she had been watching the fight. Puzzled Taehyung, the girl said that she thought that with power came responsibility. She said that power without responsibility was just violence. Taehyung turned out to be very strong. Lim didn't expect that he could defeat Shin. The guy didn't understand why the girl suddenly started talking about this. The headman stated that this was probably how Taehyung defeated John Jae. Before reaching the crack in the platform, Lim directed her power at the guy. The ice sparkled dazzlingly above this warlike maiden. Snowballs fell onto the floor, aiming for Taehyung. When they touched the ground, they lost their integrity and scattered snow all over the area. These snowballs were exactly like bombs, which, although partially, reached the guy. Just as he was thinking that invisibility was useless in this situation, Lim knocked him down with a kick to the head. The remaining stone pieces on the boy's face were unable to protect him. The girl shouted that she believed him back then in the gym. As the headmistress launched ice spears at the boy, she said she believed Taehyung was different from guys like Jung Jae and would not act for personal gain. However, after what she saw, she realized that John Jae, Bae Heksu, and Taehyung were to blame for everything. An ice block that grew out of the ground lifted the boy up, injuring him, and then also disappeared. After this, Lim pinned the young man to the ground with another block of ice. The mayor stated that using the skills without a license was illegal, and that the two ended up in the hospital. But after everything the young man had done, she had no intention of reporting him. However, Lim demanded that Taehyung withdraw from the exam. She believed that the high school student was unworthy of becoming a hunter. The guy asked who the girl was to say such a thing. Lim watched silently as Taehyung rose to his feet. He stated that the headman couldn't even stop John Jae's tyranny, strength, responsibility, dignity. All of this was unimportant because in the end, Lim wanted to eliminate Taehyung. And instead of acknowledging her fear, she used this survival game as an excuse. Lim was surprised. She expected something completely different. But she had no choice but to accept this answer. And if that was the case, then Taehyung could no longer count on her leniency. An ice hammer at least twice the size of herself suddenly formed in Lim's hand. She said she would end it all. Leaning forward, Taehyung wondered how he could get out of this situation. The stone skin, broken hundreds of times, has long since lost its function. Even if he used stealth, it would quickly disappear from wide area attacks. The monarch's heart, which increased the ability's level, had already been activated, but it was not enough to turn the tide. The predator was still locked in place, and Taehyung didn't have the stamina to inflict paralysis in melee like he did with Jung Jae. In the end, he had only one option left. The young man rushed towards the girl who was raising her hammer back. Light suddenly began to break through the ice dome, and then the sphere burst completely, scattering fragments across space. The flurry of snow made it impossible for the anxious examiners to see anything. Taewook was most worried about Taehyung. When the view improved, he and everyone else went into shock. Everything around crumbled, and cold steam emanated from the platform where Lim and Taehyung were standing. Finally, it was possible to make out first silhouettes and then a clearer picture. Taehyung hovered over the girl lying on the floor, intertwining the fingers of his right hand with hers and merging in a kiss. For the headman, such an outcome of the battle was too unpredictable. She wanted to say something coherent, but she could only mumble. Let's rewind time a little back to when Taehyung just rushed towards Lim. The girl swung the hammer and pointed it at the guy, and the weapon fell noisily to the ground. It might have seemed to some that it was all over, but it was not so. Lim realized this as she raised her gaze slightly. Taehyung was flying at her from above, but he somehow managed to avoid her attack. Under threat of death, at the last moment the guy came to the kiss. Despite how it looked from the outside, it was paralysis. Using state-affecting skills at close range, especially directly inward, had a higher chance of success. So Taehyung put the paralysis into his blood and forced Lim to swallow it, of course. Considering the monstrous resistance of the S rank, it was nothing more than a gamble. But in the end, the result was positive for the young man. Confused, Lim lay in the snow, trying to say something to Taehyung, who had already gotten up. Her resistance failed, and she was paralyzed. The system notified that the girl had suffered a severe psychological blow, and her charm had increased by 3 units. The high school student was glad that, by some miracle, his plan worked. An announcement followed that the first stage of the examination had been completed. Now the medical team had to take everyone to a safe area, and all examinees had to remain in their seats. The same announcement was repeated once again just in case. All injured participants of the exam were immediately given medical assistance by the medical team. Despite being paralyzed, Lim collected badges and was competent in combat, so she passed the first stage of the exam. Taehyung also passed the exam, collecting 7 badges. But his victory over Yunbok and Lim put him in the spotlight. When Taehyung walked past the 3 boys, they became nervous and immediately started whispering about the high school student. Walking down the corridor, the young man thought that it would be nice to have healing skills. In his previous state, he couldn't even walk. Suddenly, someone shouted the schoolboy's name, attracting his attention. It was Yunbok, who had already come too close to Taehyung and directed his electric charge at him. The schoolboy held out his petrified hand in front of him, but the defense was quickly destroyed. Shin stated that Taehyung wouldn't be able to do his tricks here. To the brawl, who suggested that Yunbok wanted revenge. For these observers, it would only be better if there was one less successful candidate, so the examinees began to actively support Shin. But Yunbok didn't care about these people or their opinions, so the angry Shin told them to shut up. Without even trying to control himself, He sprayed electricity over the entire crowd so that the examinees would know their place. Yunbok challenged Taehyung to a fair fight, and the student responded by calling him crazy. Shin wanted to prove that the schoolboy was a loser without his dirty tricks. As if confirming his madness, Shin laughed madly. But this laughter was interrupted by a terrible, crushing force. Unable to resist it, Yunbok slammed into the floor, but Taehyung still remained on his feet. Yunbok wheezed, pressing himself deeper into the floor, and the upperclassmen began to sweat from the force that fell upon them. A blue-haired man in a black suit and sunglasses was approaching the troublemakers, emitting those very vibrations that made everyone go down. He was unhappy that the boys were not letting the others enjoy their rightful break. They dared to squeak without knowing their place. This person who interrupted the conflict was the same speaker who announced the start of the first round. He was the S-rank hunter Park Sang-jin. Pak was one of the top hunters in the New South Korea Association and a future SS-rank hunter. Sang-jin was surprised that Taehyung was still standing. Pak applied even more force, but the young man, although hunched over, continued to resist. Taehyung had heard that the skill level of S-rank awakened, and S-rank hunters were different, but he didn't think it was that different. Pak decided to test whether the schoolboy could withstand what even veteran hunters could not bear. He began to increase the pressure, not fearing to harm the young man. Sanjin was stopped by the doctors who arrived and asked what he was doing. They asked what Pak was doing with the children who had just finished treatment, and whether he really wanted to exclude them even before the second test began. Sanjin explained that he was simply disciplining the boys, but this was a lie. The man did this at every selection to test the candidate's skills. The doctor said that if the hunter did it again, he would report it to the association president. But Park no longer listened to this, turning his attention back to Taehyung. He asked the young man's name and he introduced himself. Now Sanjin knew what the one who defeated Yunbok and Lim with his C rank looked like. Pak's lips stretched into a smile. No one had been able to interest him this much in a long time. Sangjin placed his hand on Taehyung's shoulder and asked if he was right in his assumption that the boy wanted to become an S-rank hunter. As he passed by, Pak waved his hand and said that he would wait for this. The schoolboy stood there, puzzled, watching the hunter go. Asking where Pa had run off to, the doctors started chasing after him. All the candidates who had passed the first test gathered in the forest thicket in front of the podium where Sanjin stood, and behind him, portals hovered in the air. The anxious participants tried to predict what they would have to face this time. Pak cleared his throat, drawing everyone's attention to himself and silencing them. He asked if everyone had time to rest, since the second round of the qualifiers for the title of hunter was now beginning. To reach the location of the second part of the exam, participants had to enter through the gate into a D-rank dungeon. Some awakened ones began to feel fear when confronted with real monsters. They were to split into teams of 5 and explore the dungeon under the supervision of a hunter. While exploring the dungeon, every action of the participants was assessed. Necessary items such as weapons and consumables were provided by the association. Now, after the explanations, the awakened ones could enter the portals one by one. Even newbies shouldn't have any problems in such low-ranking dungeons, especially under the supervision of hunters, but only if it wasn't an S-rank Apocalypto double dungeon. In Taehyung's past life, while exploring one of the D-rank dungeons, the first dual dungeon was discovered. Countless hunters, including the first group, died inside, and this led to the appearance of a mass of rifts. It would be good if Taehyung could prevent it this time, but no one would believe his words without confirmation. Even if the truth was revealed, he would be the first one to fall under suspicion. It was unfortunate, but Taehyung had his own things to do. As long as he wasn't a member of the first group, he would definitely be able to find a way to survive. Time passed and the candidates gradually left the forest, moving into another space. Taehyung was the last one in his group. 5 people were gathered, and now it was time to move out. The observer of this group was the A-rank hunter, Ma Do-hak. He was the one who discovered the double dungeon. Taehyung realized that it would not be as easy for him as he had hoped. The team encountered earth monsters. Using their skills, the awakened ones deftly dealt with their opponents. When the monsters were reduced to nothing but lumps of dirt, Do-hak clapped them. As he approached the participants, Ma praised them. He noted their determination in battle. Considering that this was their first such experience, the candidates were truly worthy of the title of hunters. The participants began to say that all this was due to the observer's instructions, but they themselves did nothing of the sort. Taehyung couldn't understand why, out of all the teams, he ended up on the doomed first research group. There was no doubt that on Do-hak's hand was a ring, which was a unique item belonging to the first explorer of the double dungeon. It was a sage's ring, with a unique rank. It increased the power of endurance, speed, and mana by 10 units. Now Taehyung was sure that they were definitely in a double dungeon, which meant that he would not be able to survive since the predator was still sealed. No matter how, the young man had to prevent the discovery of Apocalypto. After walking some more distance, the team suddenly stopped. Several branches appeared before them. The awakened asked what they should do, and Ma noted that something similar often happened when exploring dungeons. Dohak wanted to propose a vote, but Taehyung didn't allow it. The guy rushed into one of the caves, ignoring the screams. A nervous Ma warned that it was dangerous to be alone, so the young man should return. Taehyung stated that everything was fine and the others had to follow him. The young man could not allow everyone to make their own decisions. After shouting once again for the others to follow him, the high school student fell into the ravine. Despite this, everything was fine with him. He continued to run forward, forcing the other team members to chase him. Taehyung wanted to pave a different path and avoid the opening of the Apocalypto, even at the cost of his life. However, no matter how great this desire was, it turned out to be unfulfillable. The group nevertheless came across a strange portal, which, together with the cave opening, looked like a human eye. The awakened were surprised when they saw the gate, because they were already in the dungeon. And only Taehyung among those present knew that it was Apocalypto. The young man tried so hard to avoid the main path, but in the end he still ended up here. One of the awakened ones turned out to be very curious and bold, and extended his hand, wanting to touch the gate. Startling the candidates, Taehyung turned around abruptly and shouted for everyone to stop. He explained that they had already passed the gates into the dungeon, and it was unnatural to encounter another one. The boy said that such unusual cases had to be reported immediately and asked Dohak if he was right. Ma admitted that this was the first time he had encountered something like this. If the rules were followed, the team should have actually reported this to headquarters. However, now the hunter suggested going inside. Taehyung wanted to know why the man made such a decision, but Ma interrupted him, thinking that he knew perfectly well what the candidate wanted to say. Dohak explained that the magic felt inside that gate wasn't that dangerous. Plus, they were in a D-rank dungeon and the hunter was still an A rank. Ma was certain that, regardless of who had prepared this gate or where it had come from, such research would definitely add extra points to it. Alarmed, Taehyung asked if Dohak had gone crazy. The boy referred to the rules of exploring the abyss, but the hunter only laughed. Pointing his finger at the student, Ma asked if he really had to listen to that from someone who couldn't even work in a team. The candidates supported Dohak. They began to be indignant that Taehyung himself was acting recklessly. They told him not to be so arrogant just because he had some skills, and considered the guy arrogant since he decided to argue with the hunter. At that moment, Taehyung felt angry that they didn't want to listen to him for their own good, and fear because of the inevitable death. The candidates opposed to the young man lined up next to Dohak, and everything was decided. Cold sweat ran down Taehyung's face. He asked Ma to stop and think again, but Dohak didn't listen. He raised his hand up and snapped his fingers, and then there was a flash. The colors of space seemed to fade, and everything turned into black and white, and soon people disappeared in this flash. Taehyung was scared, not knowing what to do now. Nervous Ma didn't understand how it all happened. He didn't expect to end up in such a place. The candidates felt that something was wrong. They wondered if this was really a D-rank dungeon. They were in a space where red hues reigned. Along the edges of a long brick platform, there were columns that, when connected, formed an arch, and at the end of such a corridor stood a figure with a halo. The figure resembled a knight in armor with a cloak, its hands resting on a sword thrust into the ground, and instead of a face there was a skull hidden under the cloth. A cloud of dust raged in front of the motionless knight. The worried candidates asked Dohak how this happened, and if it was definitely a D-rank dungeon. The dust cloud grew, reaching the team. Taehyung demanded that everyone be silent and look ahead carefully. The hunter was unhappy that the guy continued to be rude. The youth warned the awakened that the enemies were approaching. These were two smaller versions of the statue with only one difference. Where the belly should have been, there were crystals. It was a surprise for the team to encounter Death Knight A-rank monsters. Dohak needed to collect his thoughts and start giving orders to avoid problems. Half-turning, he told the candidates to prepare for battle. The knights who were about to strike the first blow were also ready. They swung their swords, sending waves of energy upward. This caused the columns to begin to collapse and their debris to fall on people, forcing them to dodge and defend themselves. After insulting the monsters, Dohak also decided to go on the attack. He created lava under the knights' feet, which melted their armor. Then, red-hot peaks emerged from this lava, piercing and lifting the monsters. But the knights were still not defeated. They growled angrily. Ma commanded everyone to attack the immobilized creatures simultaneously. Under the hunter's orders, the candidates were to make maximum use of flashes of light and fire to blind the monsters. Those with shields had to protect the attackers, while the rest had to continue the attack, not giving the monsters a chance to strike. The participants strictly followed the instructions, attacking over and over again. Finally, the monsters were dealt with. Tired from such a shock, the awakened ones breathed heavily. Surprisingly, they managed to survive and even defeat A-rank opponents. And of course, there was a braggart among the candidates who declared that he was not even tired and was ready to fight again. But he said this in vain. Monsters appeared in front of the group again. But this time there were not 2 knights, but 4. And they all had different weapons and different halos. The group of people's mouths dropped open, unprepared for what awaited them. Taehyung dropped down to one of the defeated knights and began to dig into it. He realized that there was definitely something wrong with all of this. Having destroyed several more monsters, the young man checked each of them. Dohak, with blood on his face, was already feeling tired, finally realizing his mistake. The team already had almost an entire army of enemies in front of them, and every time the group gained the upper hand, the number of monsters only grew. Besides, everyone was already on edge. At this rate, the team could soon perish. Taehyung told Dohak that something strange was happening here. Ma wondered what kind of person this guy was. He looked cheerful even after so many battles, and was also the first to realize that this gate was dangerous. Furthermore, it was only thanks to his monarch's heart that the team's stats were so high. Otherwise, the group wouldn't have lasted so long. So questions arose as to whether this student was really a C rank. The hunter asked the young man what exactly he meant by the word strange. Taehyung explained that it was just a suggestion, but perhaps their enemies weren't Death Knights. Dohak asked what kind of nonsense that was and who they were fighting then. Arming himself with the knight's sword, the young man said that he would now go and find out. Forming stone skin on his hand, the boy rushed at the monsters. Ready to fight back, the knights raised their weapons forward. As soon as Taehyung approached, 5 knights tried to attack him at the same time. But in the end, there was no corpse under their weapons, just a small dent. While the monsters looked down in confusion, the young man flew above them. When the knights, realizing everything, raised their heads, it was already too late. Closing the distance between himself and the statue, Taehyung threw his sword at the motionless knight. When the blade reached its target, the stone cracked. The weapon was launched with such force that the statue's head ended up flying off its shoulders. The knights ran towards the young man, who was worried that his guess might be wrong. Suddenly, the monsters began to disintegrate into particles of light, and the whole space underwent changes, losing its scarlet color. It became clear to everyone that everything around was just an illusion. Taehyung clarified that it was an illusion trap. The man saw an imaginary place with imaginary enemies, thus depriving everyone who entered the gate of strength. The awakened ones could not believe that they had fought such a difficult battle with some illusions. They were afraid to think what awaited them next. Dohak became curious as to how Taehyung knew it was a trap, since he had never encountered Death Knights before. The young man agreed that he really knew nothing about these monsters. However, he was sure that real knights should not be so weak. Taehyung suggested moving on before they were all killed. The group had no choice but to continue exploring the dungeon, walking through the cave opening, Dohak lighting the way, Taehyung following behind him, helping the exhausted girl walk. The rest were able to move on their own. The illusion disappeared, but the situation did not improve at all. After the discovery of Apocalypto, the underground space was completely changed. The injuries sustained in the battle with the illusion became more serious, and the group could not simply wait for rescue. The only hope left was that the team would be able to find the exit gate from the dungeon. After some time of wandering in the darkness, the group finally came across something resembling an exit. In the darkness before them loomed a 4-meter-high gate strewn with skulls. One of the awakened ones asked if it was dangerous to enter them. Perhaps that was the case, but there was nothing to choose from. Even if they had stayed here, they would have died anyway. A red light was shining through the crack between the doors. The daredevil who decided to open these gates was Dohak. In the dark hall, the team found a Death Knight kneeling on one knee. Some of the awakened ones laughed, deciding that there was only one monster. But other Death Knights suddenly began to appear from the darkness. Everyone's mouths dropped open at what they saw. Beyond those gates, the team was awaited by more than just a small squad of monsters, as they had initially thought. At once, many skulls that served as torches burst into flames. Now it was possible to see the entire number of monsters that were lurking in this hall. The knights stood in a row on several balconies, and right in front of the team was a whole column of monsters, led by one of them. The awakened ones shook with fear, realizing that now before them were true Death Knights. Also behind this column were steps leading to a throne, on which sat a knight who was different from the rest. He laughed, surprised that some pathetic people could get to this place. This monster was larger than the others, and its skull was not hidden under the black cloth, but rather emphasized by a high collar with spikes. The owner of the duel dungeon, Lord S-Rank Death Knight, proposed to begin their duel. Making a loud noise, all the knights simultaneously slammed their swords on the floor. One of them stepped forward and waved his blade, pointing at the group. One of the awakened ones asked what was going on, and Taehyung guessed that the knight wanted a one-on-one duel. The same guy screamed he couldn't fight anymore because his mana was gone. Taehyung shouted for everyone to calm down, because their goal was not to fight, but to escape. Screaming even louder in horror, the three boys rushed back to the door. Not wanting to die, they were ready to return to where they started. But the monsters weren't going to let them escape. The knight, demanding a duel, launched a long-range attack, and Dohak and Taehyung, without letting go of the girl, dodged the energy wave directed at the fugitives. The awakened ones coughed up blood. The attack they received shattered their bones, no longer allowing them to stand on their feet. Some drops of blood flew towards Taehyung, breaking on him. The young man wanted to buy the hunter some time so that he could escape, but Dohak, not even wanting to listen to the guy, threw him back with his magic, causing the schoolboy to fall on his back. When Taehyung sat up, he saw that the hunter was about to use his abilities to separate them. The guy, who wanted to save at least one person in this trap, asked what Tevik was doing. Ma told Taehyung to shut up, as he was only a low-ranking awakened and shouldn't have argued with a hunter in such a situation. When the young man stood up, there was already a wall between them, and Dohak decided to open up. The man wanted to become an S-rank hunter, but no matter how much he trained and improved his skills, he not only didn't get any closer to it, but even moved further away. This was his chance. If he could cope with this task, he could be one step closer to his goal. And this is what Dohak's choice led him to. A Death Knight was flying towards him with a sword that emanated ominous energy. A green magical sign in the shape of a triangle began to glow under the man's hands, after which the rays of the same light cut the monster's body into several pieces. Ma noted that Taehyung was completely different, no matter how much the man didn't want to, but he was forced to admit that the young man had great potential. So he had to take the wounded and run as far as possible. And Dohak, as the eldest, had to stop the approaching monsters. The man formed a pentagram, preparing to deliver the most powerful blow he could muster. Like the last time, Taehyung shouted his name. In such a tense situation without the predator and with the wall in front of him, he couldn't do anything. The young man looked back at the members of his group. Their lifeless bodies lay on the cold floor. The injuries they had sustained were too serious, and without prompt medical intervention, they simply had no chance of survival. The stone wall behind Taehyung, built by Dohak, collapsed with a roar. Shielding himself with his hand from the flying fragments, the young man turned around nervously, expecting the worst. He saw a hunter lying face down, pierced by a monster's sword, as if mocking the weak, with enemies lined up behind him. There were stones lying on the bloody maw, and broken glasses lay next to the dying body. The killer walked forward and the others followed him. Alarmed, Taehyung was dumbfounded. He didn't know what to do, and death was getting closer. His entire team, including the hunter, perished, and he was unable to help them in any way. The young man looked at the crowd of monsters in fear. He wanted to prevent all those deaths that had already happened, but now he felt weak again. Dohak's blood dripped from the knight's sword. The monster raised his blade, challenging the boy to a duel. Everything repeated itself. The entire first group was dead. But now the time to die for Taehyung came much earlier. The young man did not move. He wanted to run, scream, do anything. But any movement would lead to death in this unequal fight. The boy watched as drops of blood collected on the tip of the sword, just as cold sweat ran down his face. At that moment, he noticed something flashing, lying on the ground directly under the enemy's sword. It was a wide gold ring with a rectangular ruby, the very same ring of the sage that belonged to Dohak. Without waiting for the young man's answer, the knight drew back his sword. In an instant, Taehyung dropped down, grabbed the ring, and ran away from his opponent, whose sword eventually hit the ground with a clang. Now the ring of the sage was his only way to survive. Putting it on the index finger of his left hand, Taehyung prayed for it to work. The Death Knights approached the boy. Enclosing him in a circle, black rays like lightning began to emanate from the artifact. Transforming into scarlet, the lightning spread further and further, making this cave even brighter. The Lord of the Death Knights looked at this disgrace with bewilderment. Everything around Taehyung was covered in a red fog. The monsters were thrown back by an unknown energy, falling apart in midair. The Lord could not understand what kind of power this was. Thanks to the ring, all of the guy's abilities increased by 10 units. Since all the conditions were met, the block on the Predator was finally removed. The bodies of the first group members, along with some pieces of the knights, were outside. Although the gates were open, it was impossible to see anything in the doorway. One could only hear the sounds of battle coming from the hall. The explosion caused by Taehyung scattered the monsters in all directions. But the knights did not give up. They continued to attack again and again. Using the Predator, the guy took away the strength of his opponents and ran on. The time required for complete absorption was approximately 10 seconds. But the young man could not rely only on the Predator. All this time, Taehyung was collecting skills and improving his characteristics. And now, to win, he had to use every last bit of it. Only in this way could he get out of this hell. As the monsters surrounded Taehyung once again, something flew past them and crashed next to the guy, making a hole in the floor and raising dust. The shock caused the young man to fall, with a huge spear at his feet. Taehyung became alarmed, not understanding what it was. His attention was drawn to the Lord standing by the throne, from whom purple lightning was flying. It was he who owned the spear that landed next to the young man. The guy became nervous, realizing that now the boss had also decided to take part in the battle. Looking up, Taehyung saw a multitude of weapons looming over him. He ran away, hoping to avoid injury. By forcing the weapon to plunge into the floor at great speed, the Lord harmed his own knights. Taehyung tried his best to dodge the peculiar projectiles falling everywhere. He was still hit a couple of times, so now he was bleeding. The guy tried to direct the Predator towards the seemingly unattainable Lord. Red, spiky tentacles reached out to the skeleton, but another power was growing in his hand. With a wave of his hand, the Death Lord interrupted the use of the skill, preventing himself from being absorbed. Taehyung was thrown back, feeling his hope slowly leaving him. The Lord noted that the guy was quite strong. However, this was still not enough to defeat such a high-ranking monster. With great force, a pile of weapons fell to the ground again. The skeleton thrust his sword into the guy lying on the floor and put his foot on his head. Before killing Taehyung, the monster decided to ask him a question. The Lord was curious as to who had given the young man such power. The skeleton's energy spread throughout the room. The boy screamed in pain from the fact that the Lord pressed harder on his head and tormented him with his abilities. The system announced that the resistance to the Lord's roar and his fighting spirit was partially successful with the help of a mysterious force. The skeleton was sure that, unlike the others, Taehyung understood the language of monsters. He asked the boy to tell him what the nature of his power was. But in response, the young man only screamed, coughing up blood. Taehyung's consciousness moved to another dimension. He stood in front of a horned giant with 6 arms. Part of his body was made of skulls. The guy looked at this creature as if with some kind of regret. Turning around, he saw Dohak and the others who had died in this dungeon in the river of blood. Lord appeared behind Taehyung. The young man thought that nothing had changed. He did not understand what the essence of the Predator was, and why he, being a human, suddenly began to understand the language of monsters. Without knowing anything, he gained strength and opportunity, but nothing changed. The Lord's sword was approaching his neck, but Taehyung didn't move, thinking only about why the king gave him power. In the bright light, the young man again saw the silhouette of the king, who stated that he had already explained this. The man said he was simply impressed by Taehyung's will and determination. The guy didn't need to change at all. He just had to keep moving forward. After this, the young man opened his eyes in his own reality. The skeleton asked if Taehyung really didn't have the strength to answer anymore. Since this was so, by insulting the guy, the monster decided to finish him off. However, the tentacles, which were thicker than before, knocked the sword out of his hands. The Predator then continued to destroy the knights who were still in the ranks. The surprised Lord looked at how his subordinates were easily crushed. Laughing, the skeleton asked if Taehyung really intended to continue fighting in this state. The young man rose to his feet and shouted as if it were a battle cry, his mana gradually beginning to increase. The skeleton was only amused by this. He was sure that this battle was the last for the guy. Throwing himself at Taehyung, Lord was pleased that they decided to entertain him until the very end. Using his abilities, the skeleton lowered his sword and a bright purple beam shot up. As the light faded, the Lord saw that Taehyung had not only survived, he had been able to repel the blow. The guy asked if the monster was truly curious about the nature of his power. The young man then added that the skeleton needed to feel it for himself. The Predator ability pierced the Lord, raising him up, thus Taehyung's rank was raised to B. The tentacles once again rushed towards the already falling skeleton. Armed with a nearby weapon, Taehyung pushed off the ground and headed towards the Lord. With all the fury he had, the boy struck the monster with many blows, causing irreparable damage. The Lord was unhappy that some weak man dared to treat him like that. Using his telekinesis, the skeleton picked up unattended swords, axes, and the like and pointed them at the young man, whose weapons shattered. But Taehyung didn't care about the lack of a sword. Power was raging in his veins. Clenching his fist, he used his predator, which flew like a hurricane at the enemy. The Lord looked on in shock as his end approached. The boy explained that it was not human strength, but the strength of a king. Only before his death did the monster manage to learn this terrifying answer, which he should have heard even before the fight began. A huge fanged mouth appeared in front of the Lord and swallowed him up. Not a single piece of the skeleton remained, and as he fell, Taehyung heard that he had registered a new skill, King Knight's Spirit. People and ambulances crowded around the portals, not understanding what was happening and worried about the lives of the examinees. The closest to the gate was the nervous Sanjin. He asked what the power level was and was told that the portal emanated S-rank magic. The order for evacuation had already been given, but it was delayed due to deformations inside the dungeon, and there were doubts whether reinforcements would be able to arrive before the breakthrough. Worried, Pak wondered where S-rank magic came from in a D-rank dungeon. He knew that everyone inside could simply die. He assumed that he would have to deal with this problem alone. Suddenly, energy began to burst out of the portal. People assumed that the gates had already been breached, meaning they had to prepare for a massacre. The energy in the portal raged more and more intensely. It seemed that the first monster was about to emerge, but when they saw the one who appeared from the gate, Pak and the others were stunned. It was Taehyung, all dirty and bloody, who said that he miraculously managed to get out. Thanks to this guy, the situation with the double gates was resolved. The examiners carried out the evacuation without serious damage, and it was decided that the results of this round would be based on the scores received earlier. The bodies of the victims were found and returned to their families safe and sound. It was decided not to reveal who cleared out Apocalypto. The Hunters Association had to deal with negative press if they were to tell the truth, then obviously Taehyung would become a target for both the media and the villains. Taewook and Sanjin understood the importance of silence in this situation and had no intention of spreading information about the boy. Sitting at the table and clasping his hands in front of his face, the chairman thanked the men for their understanding. Jinwee asked what the hunters thought of this student. The chairman rephrased the sentence and asked what they thought of the person who cleared an S-rank dungeon. Puck replied that this guy had conquered an S-rank dungeon on his own, meaning he should now be at least an S-rank. Taewook noted that although Taehyung's actual rank was much lower, he possessed a strength that was difficult to estimate. Ji asked what this meant, and the hunters looked at each other in confusion. There was a high possibility that Taehyung could become a national force. The solar eclipse painted the entire space a bloody color, and the clouds that had gathered around it worsened the already difficult situation. The young man was breathing heavily, not understanding what was happening. The monsters ran blindly forward somewhere, screaming. Taehyung stood over the gorge, watching as many different creatures passed through it. The young man wondered where so many monsters came from here. The boy realized that he was in an abyss, but he had no idea how he got there. The monsters that were exposed to the daylight became alarmed. Looking up at the sky, Taehyung saw a shining human figure, descending as if from the sun itself. It was the king, whom the young man did not expect to meet this time. The monsters growled, screamed, and stretched out their paws to the king, and he stretched out his hand, controlling such a simple gesture with his magic. The monsters turned to ashes, scattering across the space, and a path appeared between the crowd. Taehyung watched in shock as not a trace of the creatures remained. The king, still hovering in the sky, said that he would wait for the young man. He said that he would be in the deepest part of the abyss. Taehyung woke up on a hospital bed in a cold sweat. Shocked by what he saw, he breathed heavily. The sun illuminated the room, dispelling all fears but not reaching the young man's face. The guy raised himself and began to examine his hand, concentrating on reality. At first, he thought that all those monsters in the abyss and the king were just a dream. However, all this was too bright and vivid for an ordinary dream. Taehyung wondered what the king's words about waiting meant. Even S-rank monsters feared the predator, and the guy understood their language, so he had more and more questions. And to get answers, the young man apparently had no choice but to become stronger and go into the abyss. Opening the system window, Taehyung saw a new B-rank skill that could be used to defeat an enemy with his spirit. Even during the battle with the Night King, he had a sneaking suspicion that his rank had risen, and this indeed turned out to be the case. Now his strength, endurance, and speed were equal to 100 units, and his mana was 150. With such characteristics, he could compete with S-rank players. Taehyung was sure that it was the Night King's skill that was pressing on him with such terrifying force. The schoolboy was confident that at this rate he would quickly achieve national power. He looked at the door, hearing some noise behind it. One of the doctors said that it was impossible to do this, and that he would not allow anyone to enter the room, after which a scream was heard. The uninvited guest was indignant that he was forbidden to visit the sick man. He stated that even for the chairman of the association this was too much, and listening to this, Taehyung became terribly nervous. The door opened, and the guy saw a short-haired girl, behind whom beaten men were lying and groaning. Smiling brightly, Yu asked if Taehyung had thought the same thing. A black car was driving along a one-way road among white cars. There was a man in the back seat who said that he could have driven the car himself, since he was the driver here. But Aeon told him to sit and enjoy his rest. After all, Taehyung was her guest, and she wanted to take care of him herself. Deciding to break his silence, the young man drew attention to himself. He asked what the leader of the Night Walkers, one of the strongest guilds, wanted from him. The girl replied that she simply decided to take the young man home after being discharged, and at the same time see who he was that he was able to survive the apocalypto. The schoolboy didn't believe that the head of one of the leading guilds had such primitive reasons, so he asked to come up with something more plausible. Ayung noted that Taehyung was very observant, and the driver listened nervously to this conversation. The huntress asked the boy if he knew how the third test was conducted. She explained that the third test was a survival test, like the first, but the difference was that spectators would be able to watch the examinees from the stands. And when the student's abilities were revealed, surely all the guilds would want to take him in. A low rank awakened who could defeat even an S rank. That's why Yu asked him to let her be the first to make him an offer he couldn't refuse. Money, fame, she was ready to give Taehyung everything he wanted in exchange for joining the Night Walkers. The huntress extended her hand to him, and the schoolboy silently and appraisingly looked at the girl. The silence continued and the atmosphere became more tense. Beads of sweat ran down the driver's face and his heart began to beat rapidly. Finally, Taehyung said that he refused the offer, which stunned both the man and the huntress. It was already getting dark outside. Having reached Taehyung's area, the guy was dropped off. Standing at the stairs leading down between the two houses, the young man thanked Yu and the driver for giving him a ride, from where he could walk home on his own. The huntress couldn't understand why the schoolboy did this. The girl asked if Taehyung hadn't heard what she said. She asked him to give the reason for the refusal and was ready to solve any problem. The huntress wondered if the guy had already received an offer from another guild, or if he had simply misunderstood something. Her attempts to lure the young man to her side began to irritate Taehyung. The schoolboy replied that he had no particular reason to refuse them. After passing a few thresholds, Taehyung asked if the Night Walkers were really so special that he had to join them. In any case, the guy simply wasn't interested in such a thing. Since the schoolboy had nothing more to talk about, it was time to say goodbye. The young man walked down in the ensuing silence, grinning at something. But then the huntress rushed towards Taehyung and pulled him towards her, covering his mouth. The young man turned his head towards her, puzzled, and Yu asked what was wrong with him. The girl was outraged that the schoolboy had merely taken the first step towards becoming a hunter, but was already rejecting one of the 4 great guilds without good reason, which made no sense. But, removing her hand from Taehyung's mouth, the huntress declared that she forgave him. Stroking the guy's cheek with her finger, the girl said that she liked him. The nervous driver yelled that Taehyung was very young and was still undergoing testing. The man also asked the student not to irritate the girl and to simply accept the invitation, since he would have to join the guild anyway. Taehyung noted that the huntress had a hopeless stubbornness. He also stated that the girl was not Yu, but Lim Aeong. The shocked huntress wondered how the young man knew this. The young man replied that he knew a lot, including about the stolen name. The huntress seemed to lose control of herself and energy began to burst out. It seemed like everything was quiet and peaceful in Taehyung's residential area. People were hiding in their homes, getting ready for bed. But somewhere among the houses, a beam of light shot into the sky with enormous force. This power belonged to Yu, who grabbed Taehyung by the throat. The driver just looked at this. He didn't know how to deal with such a problem. The guild leader's real name was indeed Lim Aeong, the illegitimate daughter of Lim Chanyoung, the CEO of Yongsan Group. Initially, she was raised as a successor, but a new daughter was born into the family and Lim Aeon's name was taken away, turning the girl into an outcast. After this, the girl changed her last name and became a hunter, and now few people knew about this fact. The angry girl asked if he had really gone crazy to dare say such things to her face. Taehyung stated that the huntress started it first. The resistance to the S-rank Amazon spirit was successful. The young man took Yu's hand and removed it from his neck. Having forced the huntress to retreat, the boy used the counterattack of the Night King's spirit, which was successful. The huntress's hand was shaking. She didn't understand what kind of power it was. The girl was surprised that the schoolboy, in addition to being able to withstand the ability of an S-rank player, also counterattacked. The guy glanced sarcastically at Yu, who was standing just above him and who could not have expected such an outcome. The young man began to approach her, and the girl retreated. The huntress pressed herself against the wall, and Taehyung hovered over her, placing his hand on the stone pile just above her head. The guy suggested to Aeon's sister not to cross the line. Embarrassed, Lim bit her lip and growled in displeasure. The driver couldn't believe that Taehyung actually said that to the guild leader. A crowd of people gathered in a tall building that resembled the Colosseum. It was in this place that the third round of hunter testing was to take place. Unlike the first and second rounds, which were held behind closed doors, the third round was open to spectators, with a barrier erected over the arena for their safety. Industry representatives, the families of the examinees themselves, and the general public came to this stadium to see the spectacle. Yu Ah-yeon, who was also there, was eating popcorn, pretending to be an ordinary person. Taehyung's uncle noted that, thanks to the young man, they were able to see everything live, and his wife asked if everything would be okay, since she had heard that the qualifiers were very brutal. Hearing this conversation, Jae-young laughed and stated that there was no reason to worry, as Taehyung was very strong and could take out everyone with just one blow. Jae-young was Taehyung's cousin, who eventually became the president of his fan club, which only had one member. The parents said it was good, but the boy interrupted them, continuing to actively campaign for Taehyung. Reporter Kim, who was on the verge of being fired, nervously bit her fingernail. This time she needed to find the perfect story. The girls rejected the last interview because it was given by a low-ranking awakened. Kim assumed that the guy had probably already been eliminated, and if she couldn't get a decent interview this time, she would definitely say goodbye to her job. Wiping away her tears, the girl heard someone say that there was a strange atmosphere in the arena. Switching to this, Kim looked at the stadium, where the awakened ones surrounded one guy. The circle united many awakened ones, from the weakest to rising stars, and they all looked only at Taehyung. The girl wondered how strong this guy was that every single participant decided to join forces against him. The start of the third round was announced. All spectators were asked to remain calm, no matter what atrocities they might witness. So the exam began, and Taehyung grinned sarcastically, not doubting his abilities at all. All the examinees rushed to apply their various skills to Taehyung. Someone shouted that the schoolboy needed to be dealt with immediately, since he was able to single-handedly defeat two S-rankers in the first round. The candidates understood that if they failed to neutralize the young man, they would all suffer. Through the lightning, Taehyung reached the three boys, who screamed in fear. By pulling his hand back, the schoolboy formed a stone skin on it. Powerful blows followed, knocking out several of the young man's opponents at once. The examinees scattered in all directions as Taehyung rushed past them. The young man noticed something shining green starting to emerge from the ground next to him. Then vines burst out from under the floor, wrapping themselves around Taehyung. This attack interested the guy. He had never encountered anything like it before. A green-haired guy appeared in front of the young man, laughing evilly and advising Taehyung to be more careful, even if he was incredibly strong. Otherwise, the winner of this round could have been him, the A-rank genius Lee Gilson. Leaning forward, Taehyung easily tore apart the plants and landed on Gilson's head, causing the opponent to fall on his back. Receiving a strong blow, Gilson cleared his throat. The smug young man challenged the next candidates to a fight. Seeing what a monster Taehyung was, the exam participants became anxious and wanted to continuously attack the student from all sides, hoping that sooner or later he would get tired. Raising his head, the young man suddenly pointed a finger at his opponents. The guy decided to use the spirit of the Night King against them. The awakened ones were running towards Taehyung when they were suddenly illuminated by a red light. The phantom of the Night King appeared above the young man, and a strong pressure fell upon the candidates. The awakened ones lay on the floor, unable to resist this force. Every single spectator rose from their seats, shocked by what was happening. Continuing to shake the air, Taehyung smirked, feeling his superiority. Worried, Yu mentally called the young man crazy. The huntress couldn't believe that the guy used it in front of everyone. Clouds of dust billowed across the arena, and all the exhausted candidates lay on the floor. With a sigh, Taehyung declared that the cleanup was complete. However, there was still one unfinished business. It was Lim, breathing heavily, who somehow miraculously remained on her feet, clutching her probably wounded shoulder. The guy asked what they would do, since the girl could easily give up right then and there. Ayun listened to the young man without rushing to answer, She was not a coward and always achieved her goals to the last. Taehyung mockingly stated that if she didn't give in, he could remind her of the first round. The girl was both embarrassed and angry at the same time. Overcome by emotion, Lim resorted to her abilities. A cold sphere was erected around the two of them again. With his hands in his pockets, though a little nervous, Taehyung exuded arrogance. Having created her ice hammer, the girl shouted that the boy should have worried about himself. She was sure that the situation with the kiss could not happen again. But Taehyung thought completely differently. It all seemed like fun to him. Ice blocks were sticking out of the floor. This battle was no longer so easy. Lim's damaged hammer lay among the stone and ice debris. Some parts of Taehyung's body and clothes were covered in frost. He stood slightly behind Aeon, who leaned forward. The girl's muscles were unable to move, and she collapsed onto the gray tiles. As much as Lim wished things had ended differently, she still found herself paralyzed again. The girl was no longer able to hold back the barrier, so it began to disintegrate. The guy noted that in this round, Ion was, of course, the most difficult opponent for him. It was announced that the third test had concluded, and the top candidate to pass the exam was candidate number 920, Taehyung. The young man was at a table in the office of the association's president, where the boy was presented with a dagger with a black handle and blade, a certificate of successful completion of the exam, and something like a cup as a gift. Jinwei congratulated the student on becoming an S-rank hunter. Laughing, Ji admitted that he didn't think Taehyung would single-handedly finish the third round. Although given the clearing of Apocalypto, it could have been expected. Twisting the dagger in his hand and examining it, the guy replied that he was just lucky. The president smiled, about to make an offer that seemed impossible to refuse. Jinwei asked if Taehyung would like to join the new South Korea Hunters Association. The young man was taken aback by this question. For him, it was the most unexpected thing that could happen. Ji once again clarified that the guy was thinking about working for the good of New Korea. With his head lowered onto his folded hands, the man looked at the schoolboy slightly from under his brows, waiting for an answer. During this time, a lot has changed in Taehyung's life. A loser like him became an S-rank hunter and even took first place in the qualifiers. He also received a personal invitation not only from the leader of the Great Guild, but also from Jinwei himself, the strongest of the new South Korea Association. Taehyung really didn't understand what was happening in this world. But, taking a cup of green tea, the guy had already thought over his decision. The young man said that he refused this offer. The puzzled man jumped to his feet and asked why Taehyung decided that. The guy replied that he didn't have any good reason. He simply believed that, as opposed to becoming a member of one of the 4 great guilds or associations, he would be more useful working alone. The guy apologized for not being able to help. Raising his head, the president suddenly burst into laughter. Taehyung, reacting calmly to this, continued to drink his tea. Jinwei admitted that he couldn't even imagine that someone would say that it was better to be alone than in a guild or association. If the young man was so confident in himself, then the president decided not to insist on his proposal. In that case, Ji asked if Taehyung would agree to something else that interested the guy. The president invited Taehyung to participate in the Asian Friendship Tournament. The monsters screeched as they charged at Taehyung, who decapitated them without breaking a sweat with just one attack. The guy was in another dungeon, where he had already destroyed every single creature. In front of him were the gates leading to his dimension. As he walked towards them, the young man thought about the upcoming tournament. For the Asian-friendly tournament, 5 representatives from associations and guilds were selected in each Asian country, and their task was to compete with each other in hunting monsters and demons. However, to be elected as a national representative, hunters not only pursued specific monsters and demons, but also contributed to the development of the country. A kind of social value was needed. The association president believed that Taehyung was worthy of their expectation of his rapid growth. Having finally become a hunter, the boy had to hunt much stronger monsters or demons to catch up with the level of social value that others had accumulated over the years. However, even though he had cleared all known associations of the dungeon during this month, the student still had not made any progress in obtaining this value. Although it was dangerous, it seemed the young man had no choice. He would have had to go there anyway. And so we returned again to the Chonsu estate, where everything was not at all rosy. An embittered Lee took it out on the bodyguard, believing he had taught him a good lesson. Nearby lay 3 dead Dobermans. Chonsu lifted Hundo into the air with his strength and strangled him. Wheezing, Sewell asked the conglomerate to calm down, but Lee was too furious. His son, the recognized heir of the Taeson group, was still in the hospital, and the one who did this had become an S-rank hunter and was winning. Even more enraged by Sol's words, Jongsu slammed the bodyguard to the floor. Hundo crashed into the floor, losing consciousness. The girl who entered the hall said that he had a guest from the Villains Guild. Lee started shouting, asking how dare these people show up and how they couldn't deal with the schoolboy even after receiving a large sum of money. The conglomerate began to make threats, but instantly fell silent, sensing an ominous aura. Dark energy emanated from the door, which began to distort. A man with a respirator on his face emerged from the distorted space and said that he was sorry that this had happened to Chonsu's son and offered to fix it first. The man stated that the high school student was clearly not the main target of the Tayson group. Lee looked at the guest with fear, breathing nervously and stuttering. The man said he was glad to meet the conglomerate and introduced himself as the deputy leader of the Villains Guild. This man was called Shadow, and his rank was unknown to anyone. In the middle of the alley there was a purple portal. Taehyung emerged from it, stepping onto the tiled path. He was immediately greeted by an unfamiliar plump man in a business suit. The man held a piece of paper in front of him with the inscription, "The youngest S rank is Taehyung." A little nervous and stuttering, the man said that he would accompany the young man to the auction house. The man introduced himself and said that it was a great honor for him to meet Taehyung. Park Gun-woon was an A-rank hunter invited to guard during the auction. He was a member of Taehyung's fan club and had the skill of controlling the gate. Park noted that the young man had demonstrated an amazing victory in the third round of the hunter exam, which resulted in Gun-woon becoming his fan. The man asked if he could get an autograph from the high school student, and Taehyung was clearly depressed by this attitude. East Point was Asia's best auction and the largest venue in the country. East Point had many advantages, such as great auction lots, instant transfer support, and so on. Park, who received the coveted autograph on his forehead from Taehyung, said the best part of the auction was maintaining public peace. The guild guards participating in the auction, like Gonin, also played a role. But since the teleport point changed frequently, it was practically impossible to enter this place without an invitation. Perhaps this is why not a single security problem has arisen for decades. In Taehyung's opinion, this place deserved to be called the best in terms of safety. However, today, a terrorist attack by S-rank villains was supposed to take place in this place. Auctioneer Girl cheerfully announced the new lot. The best item at this auction was a Phoenix Potion, which, when consumed, increased stamina and mana by 20. Taehyung was the highest on the balcony. Now all he could do was wait for the terrorist attack. His opponents were supposed to be S-rank villains, and by dealing with them, the young man would be able to gain social value. The only problem was that the guy had too little information. Before the regression, Taehyung only knew that East Point's losses were serious, and that the main culprit of the terrorist attack was the S-rank villain Narendra Nehru. But the young man had no idea who suppressed the terrorist attack. Pak approached him, holding 2 ice creams. The schoolboy asked him who was responsible for security here. Hearing this question, the man became nervous. Taehyung explained that he was just curious about something. He asked if Gunwoon was not aware of this, and Park replied that it was not about that at all. Someone laughed, drawing attention to both themselves and Taehyung. This man named the 12th S-rank hunter of New Korea, the youngest of them all. The people moved away, making way for such an important person who had just entered. Several people in black and white suits were heading towards the high school student. The very first of them, the white-haired man, clarified whether the young man was indeed that same hunter Taehyung. The man nicknamed the Devil was Isaki Ryohei, an S-rank hunter from Japan and the head of East Point Security. Gunan told Taehyung that this man was the main guard in this place. Pak also whispered to the high school student to be careful. Ryohei even killed his colleagues for his own gain, which is why the hunters nicknamed him the Devil. Extending his hand to the boy, Isaki said that he had heard that a rare genius had appeared in New Korea, but he hadn't expected to meet him here in person. Taehyung found it strange that Isaki extended his left hand to shake his hand. When the men's palms touched, the young man felt Ryohei's strength on himself. Thousands of little lightning bolts ran through his body. The boy clenched his jaw and wheezed, feeling the pain. Watching the boy's reaction, Isaki giggled. There was madness in his gaze. His laughter became louder. The man was amused by the fact that Taehyung could withstand his strength, which was truly characteristic of an S rank. The young man mentally insulted Isaki, not knowing what was the best thing to do. Hearing someone's wheezing, the guy turned his head towards the sound. 5 people clutched their throats and fell to their knees, unable to breathe normally. The boy could endure the attacks of Ryohei's power, but he was worried that ordinary people were also drawn into it and suffered. Laughing again, Isaki noted that he had apparently gone too far with the joke for a boy who had just achieved S rank. The man finished the handshake and stood close to Taehyung, casually throwing his arm over him, almost hugging him. Ryohei whispered into the boy's ear that he would understand that not all S ranks were equal. Isaki didn't know why the young man had come to this place, but he advised Taehyung not to do anything stupid and to leave quietly. Ryohei chuckled mockingly and pulled away from the boy. Walking away, passing between his subordinates, who were lined up in 2 rows, Isaki wished everyone a fun auction and laughed again. Watching Ryohei go, Taehyung held his reddened hand, while Park, whose hands were covered in melted ice cream, looked at the guy with concern. Now the young man understood that everything would be more complicated than he thought. East Point buildings sparkled in the sunlight. Somewhere in the underground space there were 5 hunters. A crowd of unknown masked people was approaching them, led by a bearded old man who looked like a yogi with a turban on his head. It didn't matter who these people were or where they came from. The hunters' main goal now was to protect the warp gates that were behind them from them. The leader of the defenders, who had an A rank, said that he would deal with it himself, and the rest would only be there to help. However, this man turned out to be too self-confident. The fight was short-lived. All the guards met with death. The last one was an A-rank hunter, whose head was in the mouth of a monster controlled by a yogi. The creature's grip was strong. Its disgusting drool flowed down the man's shoulders, and muffled screams could be heard. Narendra Nehru, an S-class magician of unknown affiliation, looked at all this with some pleasure. One of his subordinates reported that changes had taken place at the auction house. It was said that a representative from New Korea, S-rank Taehyung, had appeared there. The villain asked what they should do in such a case. The magician stated that this named person was nothing but some kind of trash. As long as he, Narendra Nehru, was here, no one could escape God's revelation. Foretelling trouble, the sea waves beat anxiously against the rocky shore on which East Point was located. Something flew into the building, destroying several floors. A second before, the girl announced a new lot. And now, the debris was rushing towards people, causing injury to them. On another floor, a guy was smiling while drinking a drink and discussing something funny with a girl. When the wall exploded, they screamed. Clutching their heads, the rest were knocked down by the wave and flew towards the pair. This explosion was followed by many others. Screaming, Gunwoon asked Taehyung if he was okay. He said that the young man needed to evacuate immediately. The guy got nervous. He knew that a terrorist attack was about to take place, but he didn't expect that the entire building would be mined. Another explosion happened, people ran away, and Taehyung wondered where the villains were hiding and when they planted all these bombs. But now something else was more important. The young man heard people screaming. He saw people running. He saw someone in a mask and dreadlocks, holding one of the East Point guests by the collar, shooting at the ceiling. He commanded everyone to lay down their arms and take all the money and valuables to the ground. There were other villains behind him. This guy also said that if there was any attempt to resist, he would shoot straight in the head. Before he could come to his senses, his head was already cut off by Taehyung, who also wounded the other villains along the way. Pak looked at this in bewilderment. He was not as brave and strong as the young man. The boy told Gonan to immediately report the incident to the association and ask for help. Taking out the dagger he had given him, Taehyung said that he would catch those who had caused this disaster. In the basement, the guards were trying their best to protect the goods. They were already exhausted and wounded. One of the hunters stated that these sheets had already been bought, but the villains didn't care about that. The purple-haired guy, who was the leader of this group of villains, ordered his subordinates to kill the guards. The villains immediately began to chop, stab, and cut the guards. One by one, the brutally murdered hunters fell to the ground, and pools of blood appeared beneath them. Soon all the guards were dead and the goods were left unprotected. The group leader began rummaging through the boxes and finally came across a phoenix potion. This was exactly the item the villain was looking for. After consuming this potion, stamina and mana were permanently increased. Now the group leader understood why Narendra was looking for him. Even putting the lives of his subordinates on the line, just looking at the bottle, the guy felt colossal energy. A desire flashed through the leader's mind not to give the potion away, but to drink it himself. At that moment, something flew into the boxes at high speed. The guy was surprised when he realized that it was one of the villains. Someone told Dyke that it was an attack, but the problem was that the villains didn't see anyone. One of the villains, who simply could not react in any way, was hit in the head. The small fry began to feel fear of the invisible enemy. Taehyung dealt with the enemies one by one, approaching Daeku. A little alarmed, the group leader realized that the enemy had used a stealth skill. Dyke didn't quite have time to avoid the chopping blow. Blood appeared on his forehead and his mask was torn. An angry Dyke decided to use his skill. A chain began to stretch across the entire underground space. Thus, Taehyung was captured and suspended in the air by the villain's skill. Dike began to insult the guy for using such a low trick. The leader insisted that Taehyung would now meet his death. The guy analyzed that the villain had a skill that allowed him to track enemies in stealth mode. The young man decided that it would be a good idea to use the predator on him. All the guards were killed, and the ordinary people were tied up and gathered in a group. All floors of the room were strewn with disgusting monsters. And all this took place in the Warp Gate control office. Narendra was pleased with how smoothly everything went. He stated that now those who believed in God would now become even more afraid of his existence. Now all that was left for Nehru to do was to get his hands on the Phoenix Potion. A frightened subordinate reported that a message had arrived from Dike. However, there were some problems with this. The villain held out a radio, which was supposed to connect the magician with the leader of one of the groups. After checking the connection, the voice asked if he had spoken to Narendra. Not recognizing the voice, Nehru asked who it was. Dike has already become related to the wall, having experienced the predator on himself. Taehyung explained that he had what the magician needed, and if he wanted to get it, then he needed to come to the young man right now. Narendra was filled with rage and couldn't understand how Dike had managed to lose to some arrogant boy. There was silence in the basement. Everyone was dead except Taehyung. Having decided not to share the potion with anyone, the young man drank it himself. He felt an indescribable pleasant sensation. His stamina and mana increased. The unique rank potion was truly on another level. Taehyung had been running around the dungeons for so long, but his stats had suddenly increased only thanks to it. It was better to do this than to worry about the potion falling into the hands of terrorists. The young man began to hear someone's footsteps. It was Ryohei and his group of hunters. Once they got to the boxes, they found only corpses there. The hunters looked around but did not see anyone alive here. They knew that the last time they contacted each other was definitely from here, but most likely whoever it was had already fled. But a grinning Isaki refuted this thought. He stated that this man was now in front of them. Ryohei told Taehyung to come out of hiding and show himself. Introducing himself to the hunters, the young man noted that it was strange. The guy was almost sure that his skills were perfect. Isaki asked what an S-rank hunter was doing here. Taehyung replied that Ryohei himself was the head of security and had to run everywhere in an attempt to stop the terror. Giggling, Isaki explained that he needed to find one thing. Reaching into the inside pocket of his jacket, the young man said he knew something was wrong. With all these hunters acting as Ryohei's bodyguards, the man could easily find all the planted bombs. Besides, the terrorists began their assault from the western points, where permission was needed to get inside. Taehyung guessed that the villains had an accomplice in East Point, but it was hard to imagine that the head of the security service himself would turn out to be a traitor. Isaki noted that he had been very kind in warning the young man to stay away. Just like Taehyung before, Ryohei suddenly disappeared from everyone's sight. But the young man was no simpleton. He pulled out a dagger and repelled the invisible attack. Isaki demanded that they give him the thing, and Taehyung suggested trying to take it away. Golden lightning emanating from the evil Ryohei spread throughout the entire room. Taehyung also took advantage of stealth. Now the hunters did not see the two strong fighters, but only heard the sounds moving from one place to another. The predator skill was also used, which was unable to keep up with Isaki, destroying the boxes. The frightened bodyguards huddled together, understanding that this was a fight between S-rank hunters and they shouldn't interfere. Besides, Ryohei was called the Devil, and if the boys interfered with him, the man could tear them to pieces. Without seeing Isaki at all, Taehyung still tried to reflect his attacks and attack him. The young man could only predict the direction of the blows by the sound and the deadly aura. And judging by Ryohei's attacks, the boy was sure that, unlike him, Isaki saw his opponent, even while he was hidden. Taehyung didn't manage to determine in time where the next blow would come from. Ryohei's attack sent the boy flying, wounding him in the chest and stomach, and his stealth skill stopped working. Both Isaki and Taehyung used invisibility, but there was a huge gap between their skills. Now the bodyguards could see that the young man was on the ceiling directly above them. The guy decided to use the predator. He was sure that after using the potion, he definitely could not lose. The bodyguards didn't understand what was happening. They were scared by what was pulling them upward. Taehyung's arm, reinforced with stone skin, was stretched forward, and he himself, hunched over, held onto the dagger thrust into the ceiling. The hunters rose up screaming, and a terrifying force pressed them into the ceiling, damaging their internal organs. Not finding Isaki among them, Taehyung wondered where he had gone. Some laughed, noting that it was a clever decision. But stealth was indeed inferior to skills that worked over a wide area. The young man raised his head and saw Ryohei below. The hunter stated that if the guy wanted to find him, then he should have used this skill on himself. A blade imbued with energy was approaching the guy. Taehyung held out a dagger and petrified hands in front of him to minimize the damage. On the top floor, the villains stood calmly and guarded something. They were alarmed by something that sounded like an explosion. It turned out to be Isaki, who was flying upward, breaking through the ceilings with Taehyung. So in a short time, the guys passed several floors. The young man lay on the rubble, and Ryohei held his sword to his chest, thinking that such an attack should be enough to kill the enemy. However, he was surprised that the guy was still able to fight, and even used some cunning. While Isaki was perplexed, his blade was wrapped in chains. Taehyung smirked and called Ryohei a fool. Isaki became nervous, realizing that this skill was not for finding him. The young man used the skill to pull Ryohei beyond the skill's range and stop him. Isaki pushed off the ground, hoping to escape from the boy, but Taehyung wasn't going to let that happen. Feeling his inevitable defeat, Ryohei began to insult the guy. His arms, legs, his whole body began to become paralyzed. With a wide grin, Taehyung punched Isaki in the face, leaving him unable to retreat. Together with Ryohei, the boy returned back through the tunnel that had formed during the battle. Now not only Isaki but also his bodyguards were kneeling in front of the young man in chains. All of them were beaten, looked pitiful, and could only grin, not having enough strength to resist. Ryohei, unwilling to accept his defeat, was ready to call the guy the most unflattering words. Taehyung couldn't understand why a man with a large fortune would decide to commit such a stupid crime. Isaki shouted, demanding that the boy shut up. If it weren't for this youth, the man would have already achieved success. Not wanting to listen to the association's traitor, Taehyung kicked him in the head, claiming that the man talked too much for a murderer. The blow threw the criminal back several meters. The worried bodyguards turned to look at Ryohei, asking if he was okay. The young man wanted Isaki to tell him about Narendra. The guy was sure that requests for help were already pouring in from every association, and Isaki should have understood that he and Neru would receive a buyout as soon as reinforcements arrived. Ryohei's chuckle made it clear that there would be no reinforcements. The hunter still thought that Taehyung still didn't know anything. The man ran as fast as he could, passing one corridor after another. Jinwoo, with documents and graphs spread out on the table, was discussing something important with Taewook. At that moment, a plump gray-haired man flew into the room. It was the S-rank alchemist guildmaster So Sangik. The worried man asked what had happened to the East Point security. The auction wasn't just about guild items. There were also many distinguished guests there, and anything could happen to them, which was what worried So. The chairman asked him to calm down first and explained that they had immediately organized the meeting as soon as they heard about the terrorist attack. The reinforcements consisted of experienced hunters led by Sanjin. Sangik asked why they hadn't arrived there yet. If more people were needed, or if the problem was with the weapons, then his guild was ready to help. Ji explained that that wasn't the problem. East Point was impossible to get into. Terrorists have seized the central control post of the warp gates and blocked them all. This terrifying news made Sangik feel a pang in his chest, but Taewook tried to calm him down, saying that everything was under control. There were currently 2 S-rank hunters in the building, although Taehyung had, of course, only recently received this rank. While on the terrorist side, there was only one such person, Narendra. Go was confident that, until the association restored access to the gate, Taehyung and Ryohei should be able to hold out and maybe even defeat Neru. Yu, who entered, noted that this would be possible if the opponent was a normal S rank. The men glanced at the doorway. They did not expect the girl to appear. Taehyung approached Isaki. The bodyguard sat in place behind, silently worrying about the master. Ryohei asked if the boy knew of such a technique as a contract with the devil. This was the worst of Narendra's techniques. Depending on the volume and quality of the sacrifice, the magician could summon monsters of a certain rank. Taehyung didn't want to hear that the victims were people, but that's exactly how it was. Ayun informed the men that Narendra was forcibly holding people. Jinwoo didn't have this information, and it was a shock for him to learn about it. Taewook assumed that Neru had hundreds of hostages at best now, and Narendra was a notorious terrorist who had special skills, even among S-rank hunters. It was even scary to think about what would have happened if this magician had sacrificed hundreds of people and summoned demons. Yu concluded that a catastrophe lay ahead of them all. Holding Isaki with his hand, Taehyung pressed him into the wall. Taehyung called this man and his accomplices complete psychos. Ryohei stated that although the guy was lucky to win, he would never have been able to defeat Narendra. Isaki offered Taehyung a choice: beg for his life or watch as these innocent hostages were sacrificed, or prepare for a battle in which the winner was predetermined and die like a dog. Ryohei laughed madly, and bloody clouds rose above the smoking East Point, foreshadowing even greater trouble. Standing on the balcony with his hands folded behind his back, Narendra looked at the crowd of people kneeling, shaking with fear, who were not allowed to run away by the villains. One of Nehru's subordinates suggested that Ryohei had been captured. However, the location of Isaki, who most likely took the Phoenix Potion, was unknown. Nehru was confident that the young man had no chance of winning a one-on-one fight, and he needed to wait for reinforcements from the association. Narendra raised his hand, put it forward, and black smoke began to accumulate around it. People started screaming, and some of them were lifted into the air by the same black smoke. Something invisible grabbed the brunette by the throat, not allowing her to take a full breath. Nehru decided to force Taehyung to show himself, since he himself was in no hurry to do so. The girl began to cry, realizing that no one would save her and she was about to die. Narendra proposed to start a festival in the name of his god. After these words, the light suddenly went out, puzzling Nehru. The auction guests wondered what had suddenly happened to the light. The villains complained that they couldn't see anything, and they couldn't understand why the problems had occurred now, since all the bombs had already exploded long ago. The victims that Narendra was holding disappeared in an instant. Behind him, hidden, was Taehyung, chains coiling around his reinforced arms. Out of the corner of his eye, Nehru noticed the boy's movement, but it seemed he had no intention of reacting. Making a sudden move to dodge, Narendra seemed to start falling. The guy's chains wrapped around the magician. The young man was confident that he had managed to catch his opponent. But then, from under the turban, fanged, six-eyed snakes, breathing fire, began to burst forth. Having freed themselves from the chains, they began to release spheres of flame. The balls aimed at Taehyung caused small explosions, but the young man remained unharmed after jumping from this floor. It was unexpected for him that the magician hid monsters even on his head. Showing his indifference, Narendra, whose silhouette was visible through the fire, folded his hands behind his back. The people near whom Taehyung landed recognized the guy and asked if he had really come to save them. They screamed, begging to be untied and promising a reward for it. But these auction visitors only hindered the guy, who, without any unnecessary emotion, scattered the screaming people to the sides with his chain. After this, raising his head, the young man saw various kinds of monsters flying towards him. They all landed almost at the same point, striking. From the outside, it looked like the creatures had managed to deal with Taehyung by crushing him. However, pushing off the ground and scattering the monsters, the guy simultaneously dealt them numerous blows. Once in the air, the young man used the spirit of the Night King. The creatures squealed as they felt the unpleasant pressure on them. However, they were able to resist Taehyung's skill and rush towards him, who was still hovering in the air. Strengthening his hands, the young man, stunned by such a surprise, held the dagger in front of himself. Watching this, Nehru laughed, considering the guy a fool. Taehyung shouldn't underestimate the monsters created by the skilled Devil's Contract, since they weren't like normal ones. These creatures were completely under the control of the magician. Having absorbed its magical power, they became much more resilient and stronger than their relatives. Taehyung tried to attack, but it was all in vain. Under the onslaught of the monsters, he was thrown into the wall, causing blood to gush from the guy's mouth. Narendra noted that despite his victory over Ryohei, the boy should not have thought that he could overcome God's will. People watched as the monsters continued to flock to the young man. They were starting to worry again, because Taehyung was obviously losing. They were also unhappy that they asked the guy to save them, but he did it his way, and now he couldn't deal with some monsters. One of the hostages explained that everything was completely different, and they should have taken a closer look. Thanks to this hunter, monsters and villains did not pay attention to them. Taehyung continued to fight. Even though he understood the superiority of his opponents, he did not allow any of the monsters to reach the people. All the dissatisfied people fell into a stupor, realizing they were wrong. In addition to all of the above, the young man had already saved the hostages by throwing them to the other side and suspending them in the air, including those whom Nehru had held with his magic. The man who brought the people to their senses burst into tears, saying that all this time Taehyung had actually been thinking about saving them. While the hostages were safe, the young man heroically received injuries. Having realized everything, the rest of the people also began to cry and actively support the guy. The chains reached up and grabbed two monsters. With a sharp jerk of his hands, Taehyung knocked down these creatures. An indignant Taehyung shouted for everyone to finally shut up. Both the visitors to the ill-fated auction and Narendra were puzzled by the guy's behavior. The hostages were just getting in the way, and the monsters were still there. The young man didn't want to put up with it any longer. The people screamed again, afraid that the hunter would leave them to certain death. Neru laughed, asking if Taehyung was finally ready to give in. The young man suggested ending this and turned to Gonan, puzzling the magician. In the doorway, Narendra noticed another hunter who was preparing to use his skill. Neru could not understand what kind of man he was and how he ended up there. Gonan apologized to Taehyung for making him wait so long, but now they could begin. Earlier, the hunter looked in shock at Isaki lying unconscious. He stuttered as he asked what it was, and Taehyung explained that it was the so-called security service, which turned out to be in collusion with terrorists. It was worth leaving, and this is what happened, but this was not the main problem. The Warp Gate control office was currently filled with summoned monsters. Fighting the villains shouldn't have been too much of a problem for the guy, but he understood that the monsters would not sit quietly and watch, and the hostages could become their first victims. Gonan became nervous, not knowing how to handle this situation. Taehyung explained that he needed the skill to control the gate, which the hunter possessed. What he heard made the man even more worried. Of course he wanted to help, but, as was known, communication with the point connecting them with the association was now impossible. But it didn't matter. Taehyung just wanted to get rid of the monsters. The many gates surrounding the monsters glowed blue when activated. The monsters screamed as the portal began to suck them in. Narendra wondered how this was even possible. He did not like what was happening at all. The frightened monsters were drawn to the gates with such force that they were unable to resist it. When Gonan first heard about this plan, he thought it was absurd. He couldn't even imagine that it could be successful. Only Narendra and the villains remained. Gonan believed that now they would be able to win. Taehyung shouted that the hunter's role was played. He ordered Gonan to take the hostages and leave. However, the hunter did not want to abandon the young man. He wanted to help the boy. But Taehyung refused this because the opponent was too strong for Gonan. The young man wanted to fight the villain without being distracted by protecting others. An angry Neru started shouting the boy's name. The young man, smiling and flexing his arms, egged on his opponent. Gonan didn't want to leave Taehyung, but he gritted his teeth and decided to do it. He showed the hostages the way, and the people, looking back at the young man, hurried to leave the room. Seeing the hostages leave, the guy finally felt relieved. When he turned his gaze back to his opponent, he was forced to dash as the mage attacked him with fire spheres. Along the way, Taehyung grabbed some rock fragments and threw them at Narendra. Fighting them off, Neru shouted that the young man was a worthless man. The magician began to unite all the snakes on his head into one larger one. As Narendra made the monster rush towards Taehyung, he declared that such a weakling would not be able to stop it. The guy had to defend himself from a snake rushing towards him. The collision was serious, raising a cloud of dust. As Neru created the monsters again, he shouted that it didn't matter how many monsters Taehyung destroyed, and it didn't matter how many hostages were saved. After all, the young man, in the magician's opinion, still could not defeat his opponent. The guy who found himself on the ground rose up. Several monsters were already ready for battle. Narendra declared that for the sin of desecrating the name of God, the unbeliever Taehyung had to die. At Neru's request, the newly summoned monsters rushed at the young man. Rising to his feet, the boy asked what the magician was muttering under his breath. He claimed that Narendra himself was about to die. Taehyung used Predator, which instantly destroyed the monsters running towards him. Parts of their bodies were scattered all over the room. Neru's mouth fell open and sweat appeared on his face. The magician didn't expect that the boy could hide such power. Hearing his opponent's laughter, the young man became puzzled. Narendra spread his arms and laughed even louder. Neru folded his hands in a prayerful gesture and said that Taehyung had made the magician admit that he was the better victim. Neru also stated that it was not only the young man who hid his strength. The nearby villains suddenly fell to their knees. Blood began to spurt out of them spontaneously, and the poor fellows began to scream in pain. Taehyung watched in stupor as people crumbled into tiny pieces. Blood was oozing from Neru's back, but it was rising upward, forming a hemisphere inside which another monster was forming. The sacrifices were made, and now Narendra prayed to God to send down heavenly punishment on the sinners. Spreading green light, a winged monster appeared in the room, unlike any before. This was the S-rank bone dragon. Night was already hanging over the slowly smoldering floors of East Point. Trying to finally get the untied hostages out, Gonan encountered a group of villains. He was nervous, realizing that there were still many terrorists in the building that he might not be able to handle. The villains assumed that the people in front of them had escaped from the upper floor. One of the terrorists decided that the hostages were fugitives anyway and that they could all be killed. But blood also began to flow from these villains, which frightened them. The hostages and the hunter watched in bewilderment as the terrorists disappeared. People felt shaking, after which the ceiling began to crumble. Hearing a very loud noise behind the glass, Gonan looked out the window. There he saw Taehyung falling, with a bone dragon chasing him. Narendra was also riding on the back of this monster. On the brink of death, the young man screamed, and Nehru burst into laughter. The amused magician claimed that the dragon was the most powerful creature. Not wanting to lose, the stubborn guy threw the chain into one of the holes in the building. So Taehyung pulled himself into the hole and stopped his fall, landing on his knees on the floor. He was saved from becoming a pancake and given some time to catch his breath. The guy wondered where this monster came from. But time ran out, and the monster and the magician appeared before his eyes again. Rushing at great speed, the dragon pushed Taehyung, sending him flying. Along the way, the giant also destroyed everything in its path. The boy, launched into the air, soon crashed into a wall. However, this did not stop the young man. The bricks fell apart pitifully under his onslaught, and Taehyung continued his incredible flight. Narendra shouted after him to the poor man to die. But the poor fellow didn't plan to die. He grinned angrily, calling the reptile a bony bird. Deciding to try his luck again, the young man resorted to the predator. The terrible tentacles were moving towards the dragon, but here's the problem. A green translucent ball was visible in the monster's mouth. Having finished creating it, the lizard spat the sphere at the unsuspecting Taehyung. There was a massive explosion that should have destroyed half of East Point. The green light beautifully illuminated everything around, adding a touch of spice to the atmosphere. Looking at these magnificent tongues of flame, the old man was amazed. He never expected that the boy would be able to survive such an explosion. Taehyung held onto the wall with all his might, but surprisingly it didn't collapse. The guy was breathing heavily, thinking about how incredibly strong this old man was. The youth barely managed to block the attack using all his strength. He couldn't believe that they were of the same rank. However, Taehyung was sure that Narendra was not in the best position either, trying to control such a huge power. Indeed, the veins on his hands, which Nehru hid behind his back, bulged unnaturally. The guy assumed that the magician had already reached his limit. The young man decided that if he stalled for time, he could have a good chance of winning. Narendra stated that right now he could see all of Taehyung's thoughts. To be more convincing, Nehru clarified that the guy wanted to stall for time. Grandpa noted that this tactic was quite good, but the problem was that such tricks did not work on Narendra. The dragon changed its flight path by flapping its wings. Taehyung was worried because Nehru headed towards the hostages, intending to sacrifice them too. The people, not even thinking of running away, stood motionless and just watched as the dragon was about to strike them with its tail. The dragon spun and smashed the panoramic window, sending shards and brick fragments raining down. The association building was illuminated by 4 spotlights. Finally, the connection of the emergency warp gate was completed. A stable connection with East Point was established, and a squad of hunters was already standing in front of the portal that had appeared. The only country that was still in contact was New Korea, and entering that gate was very dangerous even for a hunter like Sanjin. But Pak thought that all this was nonsense. He made the operator nervous by asking what kind of threat the guy was facing back then. Sanjin commanded the fighters to move to East Point right now. Entering the gate first, he said that it was necessary to destroy all the monsters and find colleagues. Due to the dragon's attack, all the people were lying on the floor. Almost all of them were unconscious. Under Gonan, who had hit his head. Coming to his senses, the hunter saw a bright light and sat up to understand what was happening. At the very edge of the half-destroyed floor was Taehyung, who was trying to contain the green fire with the help of the predator. Gonan was glad to be saved, but at the same time he was worried about the life of the young man, who had already given it his all. The guy's scream grew into a roar, and it was already quite difficult for Taehyung to block such a flow of energy. The dragon had no intention of finishing. He still had plenty of strength. The old man laughed. He knew that the young man would choose to protect the people. Narendra didn't care about other people's lives. He wanted to burn everyone alive. Alarmed, Gonan shouted out the young hunter's name. The man asked him not to worry about them, because if Taehyung died, it would be the end for them anyway. The young man began to lose his breath. Drops of blood were falling from him. He thought that Gonan was right. Now the guy couldn't stand up to the bone dragon one-on-one. The only thing left for him to do was to wait for Narendra to reach his limit. But Taehyung definitely couldn't give up now. The boy struggled to figure out how to protect the others. The young man was stunned when he heard someone's voice declaring that he could not go on like this any longer. A dumbfounded Taehyung looked around, trying to find the owner of that voice, but in the back, only Gonan was conscious. The hunter looked questioningly at the confused young man. The guy tried to understand what it was. What he heard sounded like the king's voice. At this point, the predator's skill was adjusted and reached rank A. But things did not stop there. The limits of force were exceeded. The body could no longer withstand the power of the skill, which had reached SS rank too quickly. Having stopped attacking, Neru looked at Taehyung in surprise. Defense gave way to attack, and the red tentacles, which had already reached SSS rank, once again reached out to the old man. The guy tried to stop it, but it was already impossible to cancel the skill's effect. Scraps of clothing were torn from Taehyung's body. He screamed from the fact that the predator was now causing him hellish pain. The guy was shocked by such an incredible flurry of force. He realized that the voice really belonged to the king, who apparently transferred all his powers to the young man. Taehyung's entire body began to crack, and his right arm even broke off and fell. The boy wondered if he would really die such a useless death. After everything he had achieved with such difficulty, Taehyung didn't want to put up with it. No matter how hard the young man tried to withstand such enormous force, it was not enough. Eventually, the boy lost consciousness and fell to the floor, bleeding. Narendra realized that Taehyung had now activated his skill at full power. But now, Neru was faced with an insane amount of energy that he had never seen before in his life. And yet, what surprised the old man most was that the boy couldn't withstand the power of his own skill and passed out. But despite this, the predator was still active. The old man, dissatisfied with this, began to grind his teeth. He declared that since Taehyung was going to oppose the god to the very end, Narendra would destroy him with his own hands. A clawed paw moved towards the young man, and it seemed that this was the end. But no. In a split second, this very paw, along with the wing, was cut off. The old man would be shocked by this. Although a couple of seconds ago he was rejoicing at his victory that had not yet come. Taehyung, whom Narendra was no longer looking at, rose to his feet. Neru began to sweat and looked around anxiously. In the sky, the tentacles of a predator were gathering in a whirlwind. And next to East Point, 5 huge long necks with dragon heads were writhing. They growled menacingly, warning that it was not worth messing with them. The old man swallowed nervously, looking at this colossus, compared to which his bone dragon was a small bug. To attract attention, the young man began to mock Narendra for talking about some god. Covered in cracks, the boy smiled, his black hair changing to red. Neru looked at him with a puzzled look. The old man asked who he was, because it was clearly no longer Taehyung. The young man's hand was also restored, but it was slightly different and glowed scarlet. Neru asked where such a violent power came from, and the boy replied that insects were not supposed to know that. Besides, the old man was already dead. The tentacles darted past Narendra, scratching him. Then they disappeared and everything seemed to calm down again. But the next moment, Predator was used with renewed force, incinerating the dragon and Neru himself, thus registering the new skill, Devil's Contract. Taehyung's consciousness was somewhere in the darkness. The young man couldn't understand how he had gotten from East Point to a place where nothing could be seen. Suddenly, chains appeared from somewhere and began to bind the guy. After this, boulders appeared and started flying towards him. Hitting the ground, Taehyung coughed up blood. The young man guessed that it was stone skin and paralysis. He was trying to understand what was happening here, when hands appeared in space and playfully moved towards the guy. Taehyung screamed, feeling the spirit of the Night King again for the first time in a long time. The boy wondered why his skills were not obeying him. Someone chuckled at the fact that the young man considered them his own. The voice asked why Taehyung assumed it was his power. Someone said that the guy had absorbed it and now had to experience this power on himself, after which the form of the predator rushed towards the young man chained to the stone surface. Taehyung looked in horror as the creature approached. Having fallen out of bed, the young man could not catch his breath, waking up from a nightmare. All wet, the boy looked at his hands, wondering if this had all been a dream. He was whole, and his right arm, broken by the predator, was back in place. Sanjin, who was eating a fish bun, came to the guy. He asked if Taehyung wanted to try the treat too. Soon, in addition to the fish, a couple of dishes appeared on the table. Park explained that the association, together with the alchemists, had prepared this apartment specifically for Taehyung as a way to repay him for his assistance with the terrorist attack. Thanks to the young men, they discovered Ryohai's connection to the terrorists, and now he has been arrested. Surprisingly, many were able to survive, given the scale of the attack. The hunter reported that different people came to visit the boy. Among them, besides the crying relatives, was the chairman.